He is the avenging sun, born of forbidden love between two worlds. Namor, monarch and champion of the undersea kingdom of Atlantis, stands ever vigilant in defense of his realm. Scourge of the seven seas, emperor of the deep, prince of the blood. All who challenge his kingdom, be they friend or foe, face the inexorable wrath of the Submariner, Imperious Rex.
This is Comic Geek Speak, episode 1718. Spotlight on Namor, the Submariner.
Stronger than a whale, he can swim anywhere.
He can breathe underwater and go flying through the air.
The noble Submariner, prince of the deep, to be ready any demon.
Lord Namor of Atlantis is the prince of the deep.
Ta-da.
Welcome, one and all. Murd, I've been looking forward to this, to hear that tune for months now. I forgot about that heavy baritone there at the end.
I suspect that's Thurl Ravencroft of You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch fame.
Maybe so. You would know, my friend.
Can't prove it, but it certainly sounds like him to me.
Well, in case some of our listeners aren't aware, that is a authentic 1966 theme song for the Grant Ray Lawrence Submariner cartoon.
And it's a total new one on me, Chris. As I've said before, those Grant Ray Lawrence productions just were not a part of my childhood. So this is my first time hearing that opening tune.
I'm honored to help rectify that terrible omission in your youthful experience, my friend. And we'll talk about that when we get to the other media section of our spotlight. Why don't you start, though, with our wonderful sponsor for today?
Oh, of course. Happy to, Chris. This episode of Comic Geek Speak will be brought to us by the Collection Drawer Company, makers of the Drawer Box, the easy access storage solution, which is a godsend for those of us who have giant piles of traditional comic book storage long boxes lying around our living space, because now you can access the comics that are in the bottom of box of one of those piles by pulling a drawer-like structure out of the front of your drawer box instead of having to open it from the top, as is the case with traditional long boxes. It's a groundbreaking design innovation of theirs at the Collection Drawer Company, and this just in, now every size and shape of drawer box made boasts a new double wall construction, which makes drawer boxes, which were always sturdy before, about twice as strong, durable, and stackable as they have ever been. So now you can stack your drawer boxes up even higher. They're more stable as a result of this new construction. You can kick them around. Somewhere there exists video of convention attendees in cosplay hitting drawer boxes with a hammer and doing no damage. So they're pretty strong, and now they're even stronger than ever. They're available, as I alluded to a moment ago, in a variety of sizes and shapes. You can get them not only at comic book size, but magazine size, LP record size, and so forth. And they also offer a number of accessories, including the Box Locks anchors, which help to prevent box tipping. They'll stabilize those stacks of your drawer boxes. And the Box Sort Upright dividers, which helps you to organize the contents of your drawer boxes and also prevent said contents from tipping and spilling around and getting their spines cracked and so forth. And if you happen to have a large collection and need to convert a whole lot of traditional long boxes into drawer boxes, they do offer volume discounts for large orders. So visit their website at collectiondrawer.com for many more details. You can also find them on Facebook under the name Drawerbox, that's all one word, storage system, and they're even on Instagram as Drawerboxes. So give them a try. The Collection Drawer Company at collectiondrawer.com, and their wonderful product, the Drawerbox. I've got quite a few of them in my apartment, and it does make my collection that much more accessible and researchable, especially for projects like the one that Chris and I are about to embark upon in this episode.
Well done, brother, as always. You're a magnificent pitch man.
I apologize that I'm not in the best of voice today. I'm still recovering from a little bit of a post-Christmas crud.
And I want to point out, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that Murd is here, despite that he's a little bit under the weather, I am deeply honored, as he's going to be my co-pilot on this latest Spotlight.
Your first mate, if you will. Did not care to miss it, Chris. I really did not.
Thanks, bro. I return the British naval salute. Now, before we get into our initial reflections, just a couple sort of opening comments. I was thinking, in the fall, I want to do a new Spotlight. It's been a while since Ren and I did the Hulk and the Silver Age this past summer. And, the vicissitudes of modern life and parenting and working and all that. Sometimes it's hard to get a spotlight out, but I really wanted to get one in before the very end of the year. And I was thinking about different characters I wanted to do, and I've settled upon Namor primarily because I realized, not really realized, but I sort of revisited the notion that Namor is one of the most influential characters in the American comic book. And he's probably not well known to, let's say, the general public who are familiar with, like, characters like Iron Man and Spider-Man and Captain America and so forth. Mert, I remember you saying once that Alex Trebek, this was his favorite comic book character.
That is correct, yes. Yeah. Which always struck me as a little unusual, because Namor is a character that's been out there for such a long time, and yet so few people, a lot of people like Namor, but very few people tend to think of him as a favorite. And here's the ever-erudite Alex Trebek, who is acknowledging Namor as his favorite character.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully we'll do Namor justice here, and not that I ever think Alex Trebek's listed this, but hey, you never know. But when I think about first of all, Murray just hit the nail on the head there. Namor's been around since 1939, so a year after Superman. So in the same year as Batman.
Yep.
So
if you count his first appearance, as we'll get to in a minute, he actually came out a little bit before Batman.
That's true. Well done, my friend. Murd, again, I'm glad you're here. So this is an enormously important figure in the history of the American comic book in terms of characters, and the influence of this character continues to be felt to the present day. Like if you're someone who loves a character like Wolverine, for example, or the Punisher, or other, sort of anti-hero types, vigilantes, etc., they all owe a debt to Prince Namor, the Submariner, and to his creator, Bill Everett. So we're going to be talking not only about the Submariner and his history as a character, we're also talking a little bit about Bill Everett as well, because Bill Everett, he doesn't get as much play as, say, a Jack Kirby or a Stan Lee when people recount, the history of influential creators, but he is enormously important. And just for this creation alone, he's done other stuff we'll mention as well. But the impact of the Submariner cannot be overstated, and I hope we do the character and Mr. Everett some justice here. So, Murd, thanks again for joining me, bro.
A pleasure, and more than a pleasure, my friend.
All right, let's start with, as per tradition, we ever do a spotlight, we always do our cast reflections. And again, today it's just Murd and I. Shane is ill, unfortunately. He'll recover. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen. But he was laid low with unfortunately, a holiday illness.
Yes, and I sympathize because the same thing happened to me.
Yes.
But don't worry, Shane will bounce back. He always does.
So, Mert, let's start with you. When you think of the Submariner and Namor, etc., Atlantis, that whole world, when it comes to the Marvel version of it, what impact has that had in your reading life?
Well, Namor, I don't know, fittingly enough, I guess, since Namor is a part of the prehistory of Marvel Comics as timely, he's also part of my prehistory as a comic book reader, because I actually did learn of him sometime before I became interested in comics, but only shortly before, though. We're talking about 6th grade. I didn't start reading comics until 8th grade, when my friend Matt got his hooks in me. But there were other people in our grade who also read comics, and one of them was a kid named Justin Weatherholtz. Tall guy, one of the tallest kids in our class. He's still taller than average today. And he's a successful tattoo artist nowadays, but as a 6th grader, he was a comic book fan. And I guess I saw some of the comics that he and a couple of his comic book friends would trade among themselves. I think I actually saw one of those ever-present Marvel Universe trading cards before I ever saw Matt's collection.
Of course.
I saw a couple of his, and one of them was Namor, and the Submariner, which I'm happy to say that I pronounced correctly from the start, as did Justin Weatherholtz, so that when the time came that Matt and I began, he sort of dragged me into the hobby by my ankles, I was able to correct him as to the pronunciation of Submariner, since Matt, like so many, like generations of fans before him, pronounced it Submariner.
Yes.
Yes, of which more a little bit later on,
yes.
Since Matt just fell into a very old pitfall there. But I remember the image of Namor, and it's strange that this is one of the earliest images I have of Namor, but it's from one of those Marvel Universe trading cards, and it's him riding on the back of the Griffin, which is something that he did for this brief little odd period at the very beginning of the 90s during the John Byrne written and drawn Namor the Submariner series. The Griffin, he was a supervillain in the 70s. He was human originally, and he subjected himself to certain mutagenic treatments to give him the strength and ferocity of a lion and also wings, but those mutagenic processes eventually, gradually devolved him all the way to bestial form in body and mind, so that he ended up as basically a red lion with wings. And Namor freed him from captivity at some point, and for a time rode around on his back. And this is a mutated human being, and Namor is riding on its back everywhere. And it's just a very odd little footnote in Namor's history.
Yeah,
and
I
yet
wasn't familiar with that. Well done.
Yeah, it says, thanks to that stupid trading card being one of the first images of Namor I ever saw, it became kind of a ground-in image for me.
So did Namor ever free him and let him go into the wild, or what?
Eventually, I don't know how their association ended, but sooner or later he did. He was re-evolved to something more like a humanoid state. He was able to stand erect and I think maybe speak again after a time. His human name was Johnny Horton. Yes. Not the same Johnny Horton who sang Battle of New Orleans and Sink the Bismarck, mind you. I hasten to reassure our older and more countrified listeners, but it's completely different and more fictitious Johnny Horton was the Griffin. So he really wasn't a part of Namor's life for that long, but he was kind of a occasional antagonist in various 70s comics, like the team-up titles.
I remember him, sure.
My other impression of Namor early on was that he kind of looked something about that elfin appearance of his, the tiny little Speedo trunks that he wore, and the high arched eyebrows, the pointy ears, the angular skull, and those lovely little ankle wings, which defy all physics in allowing him to fly through the air somehow. He seemed to me like something out of an early 20th century storybook, and at the age of 12, I knew from early 20th century storybooks because I'd read quite a few of them in my early childhood, and I knew right away that this must be an older character. He looks like something left over from a few decades ago, and it wasn't long before I got my hands on my copy of Les Daniels' excellent hardcover history, Marvel, 5 Fabulous Decades of the World's Greatest Comics, which was published at I guess 30 years ago.
I remember getting that. Oh, my God.
At the 50th anniversary of Marvel and of the Submariner, since the two are kind of synonymous, coterminous. So it was there that I learned a little bit more about Namor's early past and how he had been kind of that rare bird or rare fish, if you will, that was in conflict with other superheroes and with all of humanity for much of his early career, even before such things became fashionable in the Marvel age of comics and beyond. And I even got to read a 1950s story of Namor by Bill Everett, which was included in the back. There were several classic Marvel tales from different eras that were reprinted in their entirety at the back of that book. And the one that I got to read was a story called Vengeance, which is from Submariner number 35 from August of 1954, my notes tell me, in which Namor battles kind of a creature from the Black Lagoon knockoff, whom one assumes Bill Everett probably saw as a knockoff of his own creation, and so they gave a little bit of turnabout to him. That's the vengeance in the story.
Right.
Really. It's Everett striking back at the creature from the Black Lagoon for being a cheap imitation of his Namor. The Gill-Man was called Elmer in that story.
Of course.
So there that is. And as far as the Namor and his world and all of that, it's just kind of like an undersea Roman Empire. Constantly at war with the barbarian hordes knocking at the door.
Yes.
Ever embattled, ever in flux, much like
Tuma.
the ocean. It's not a Tuma! It is a Tuma, actually. But we'll get to him later, too.
We sure will.
But yeah, it just felt to me, it's no accident that Namor, it took me an embarrassing number of years to figure this out.
Murd, I'm right there with you. Don't be embarrassed.
I was in high school, so not that long, but Namor was Roman spelled backwards.
Yep.
And that's probably no accident either, because he's got that sort of classic patrician nobility about him, the aquiline nose and all his other fine features, inhuman though they are. There's sort of an elevation of certain noble physiognomical, I think that's the adjectival form, traits of humankind. He's the best in us, he's the worst in us, and he's this constantly tormented and impetuous monarch whose changes in mood mirror the ever-changes of the mercurial ocean depths in which he makes his home.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just got a chill right up the spine, into the cranium. It was almost tantric.
Wow.
See, first of all, the fact that you mentioned, was it Johnny Horton? Was that the name?
Mm-hmm.
And Sink the Bismarck. Murd, these are the gems I count upon when we do these episodes. See, if you could see, ladies and gentlemen, he has his legendary yellow legal pad with his diminutive script. Now, Murd's saying, before we started recording, he said, Chris, I'm sorry. I wasn't able to devote as much time to research as I would have liked. Mm-hmm. He's still got a page and a half crammed full with notes. Mert, I'm sure it'll suffice.
It would have been twice that if I'd had just a couple more days. But I'm going to, as long as this treasure trove lasts, Chris, I'm just going to keep feeding the gems to you.
Appreciate it, brother. I count on it.
all yours.
One point you made I thought was excellent right off the bat. You talked about Namor being both the good and the bad, like his mercurial moods and so forth. And that's at the essence of the character, which is that we're not talking about Superman today, right? We're not talking about someone who you can always count on to quote, be good, end quote. This is a far more complex. Not that Superman isn't complex, but this is a very different type of character.
I may break in for just a
please.
moment with a brief quotation from the aforementioned Les Daniels book. If Superman was America's superego, then the Submariner was its id.
Perfectly put. Perfectly put. We'll return to that in a moment. So my reflections come from two sources. One, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to start with it, is the Grant Ray Lawrence cartoon. That's where I first became aware of Namor the Submariner. Because I didn't have any comics. In the original comics I got from my cousins or convenience stores or flea markets, I never had any Submariner comics. I don't recall them appearing in the comics that I had. So I loved the cartoon. It was on WPIX, after school when I was a kid in the early 80s. There were reruns, of course. And, they played, Cap, Hulk, Iron Man, Thor, and the Submariner. I was like, who is this guy? Like, I knew who Aquaman was because I watched Super Friends and all that
of course.
growing up. But I'd never heard of the Submariner before. So I was like, all right, he's got these funky green scaled trunks, and he's light-skinned, but all the other Atlanteans are blue-skinned. And like you said, it's kind of like a Roman-like environment underwater. And I was intrigued, but I was a young kid. It kind of didn't go beyond that. And then, roughly the same time period, again, I mentioned this many times on the air, Origin of Marvel Comics. Right, so Stan Lee's, again, his interpretation, his version of the genesis of the Marvel Universe. And the Submariner doesn't have an entry in that book, but he appears in the second Hulk story they reprint. Every character featured in the book got 2 reprints. Their origin story, then a later story to show the character had sort of developed since their first appearance. And that story, and actually, when we did our Hulk spotlight on the Silver Age, you'll recall that we ended with this issue. We sort of ended that spotlight as we got into the early late 60s. It's Hulk 118, 15-cent cover, guest starring the Submariner, written by Stan Lee and art by the late, great Herb Trimpe. And the late, great Stan Lee at this point, too, unfortunately. My
goodness, yes. That does take some getting used to.
It does indeed. And this is the first time I read a story with the Submariner in it. And I was immediately enthralled with the world of Atlantis. Dorma's in it. Vashti, his faithful Vizier. Is it Vizier? How do you spell that word?
Vizier.
Vizier. Okay.
Yeah, it's not French. I think it's originally from Arabic.
Yeah. Who's like his chief counselor, who he often ignores, much to usually Namor's regret later. And beautiful Herb Trimpe art, and I got a sense of the power of Namor. I mean, he goes toe to toe with the Hulk in the story and lives. and
not that many characters in comics that can say that.
Yeah, and fights him toe to toe, as I said. And Atlantis, a lot of it is devastated during their battle, and it's a thrill to watch. You see how Namor will create like a whirlpool to kind of try to force the Hulk to suffocate, and which the Hulk, of course, breaks out of it. But you get the sense that Namor is very temperamental. He's raging because he thinks because Dorma basically she finds Bruce Banner floating on the surface of the sea, and she takes him into Atlantis. And Namor's incensed, thinking that she's hiding another man in the palace. And then he realizes the Hulk, and they do battle. But that was my first comic exposure to the Submariner character, and I loved him immediately. I loved the brashness, the power, and I want to learn more about the world that he was inhabiting. Now, what's interesting is, and we'll get into this as we go through the history, let's call him the Stan Lee Submariner, is many ways very different from the Bill Everett Submariner.
You know, reading that reprint in that Les Daniels book made that very plain to me.
Yeah.
I remember thinking, wow, he was unusually fond of American slang back in the old
Yes,
days.
yes. Well put, Murd.
Sufferin' shad as opposed
Yep.
to Imperious Rex.
Yes, and so, like, for example, I'm looking in that my beloved Hulk 118, the reprint from Origins of Marvel Comics, right here on the table in front of me. And at one point, you know, Namor's incensed, and you know, he's enraged with jealousy, thinking that Dorma's hiding another man, and he, you know, throws aside the Atlantean soldiers guarding her chambers, breaks from the door and shouts, "Dorma, stand you forth!" And that's pure. It's almost like Thor underwater in a sense, like that kind of imperious
Right, pseudo-Shakespearean
dialogue.
bombast.
And you know, I love that kind of hyperbole, and it made me want to learn more about the Submariner. And I guess that, you know, Origins of Marvel Comics did its job in that sense, because I want to learn more about all these characters I was reading in this, then in the companion book, Son of Origins, and Bring on the Bad Guys, and so forth. So as time passed, I started to read more about the Submariner. I got some individual issues, reprints, some of his appearances in the Avengers, the Defenders, and as the years passed, I started to get a better sense of the character. But most interestingly, and Murr just mentioned this before, is, you know, I didn't realize right away how old the Submariner is in terms of it being an established comic book character, and how influential he is, and how much he's changed in some ways over the years, especially from the sort of the Everett timely Atlas era into the Marvel Age. So we'll be taking you on a journey. I hope you'll enjoy it as we go through the Submariner's history. And again, we're not going to checklist, because kind of like we did our Dr. Doom spotlight some years ago. When you have a character who's been around this long and has been this involved in every sort of nook and cranny of Marvel's history, you can't possibly recount every single appearance. There's got to be hundreds, if not thousands, at this point.
Yeah.
Guest appearances, team appearances, his own books. So we're going to touch upon the highlights. What my hope is, my fond hope is that, as any spotlight, this will encourage some of our listeners to want to read further and go more in depth into the character. Murr, anything else you want to say before we jump into some initial quotes and so forth?
Yep, let us submerge.
All right, so one of my key sources of the spotlight was a book by the author Blake Bell, published by Fantagraphics. Bill Everett, The Submariner and the Birth of Marvel Comics. It's called Fire and Water. It came out several years ago. It's an excellent book, and it goes in depth into not only Everett's history, the Submariners as well, you know, through the Golden Age. A vital resource. I'm going to quote Bell here describing what he sees as the significance of the Submariner as a character in the American comic book medium. And Murr, this kind of plays on what you were saying before, actually. Mm-hmm. Tapping into the id of a Depression-era population worn down by a decade of anger, confusion, and despair, comic book audiences reveled in the Submariner's freewheeling antics. Everett had created comics' first anti-hero, setting up a long lineage of other writers who would use this template to create popular half-heroes/half-villains, often misunderstood, a product of circumstances who would have to come to peace with straddling the line between social mores and their own alienation. You want any comments on that?
Well, yeah, I've seen the term anti-hero applied to Namor a few different places as I did the research I was able to do over the past couple of days. And I've never thought that was really the best way to describe Namor. He's almost, I think I'd almost call him more an anti-villain than an anti-hero.
What do you mean by that?
Well, an anti-hero is really more someone who lacks traditional heroic qualities, who for one reason or another is thrust into a heroic or protagonistic role in a story. Namor, I mean, he's got the nobility. I mean, he is a heroic figure. It's just that his heroic tendencies and qualities are in service of a foreign power whose interests are antithetical to those of the reader, i.e. contemporary United States. And so he's kind of like the hero of a foreign nation. So I don't know that I wouldn't go so far as to call him an anti-hero.
That's an interesting point, and I concur, because... And I was using the term anti-hero freely before, and that's often how Namor is portrayed when people talk about the character. But you make a valid point in that he is a king. Like we talked about T'Challa, the Black Panther.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? his interests are not always going. Sometimes they'll coincide with the surface world or with the United States. Other times they absolutely will not. And sometimes we'll see Namor as being on the wrong side of a conflict, or we may say, you know what, he's kind of got a point, and I kind of understand where he's coming from, and why he's raging, and this and that. And we're going to talk about there are instances in his publishing history where he'll do things that that some people would see him as a war criminal in a sense. Things against the surface that if this were real life and we were on the receiving end of mechanized whale ships, creating floods and drowning our military, we wouldn't be thrilled with Namor essentially. There's actually a great moment in the Golden Age where he's actually convicted and given the electric chair, which of course only revitalizes him further. But you've made a good point, Murd. This is, as far as superheroes go, one can often apply the anti-hero label to Namor. But you're right. I think you made a great point. He's more than that. We're not just talking about like a vigilante per se.
Right. He's not a villainous or otherwise non-heroic figure thrust into the role of hero. Yeah. He is a noble, heroic figure often thrust into the role of villain.
Right.
By various circumstances, including sometimes his own bad temper.
Bad temper, and we're going to talk about in terms of retro continuity where that temper may come from.
I saw that on your notes. That's kind of a fascinating detail.
We'll get into that. And also as a monarch, he has certain interests where Atlantis has to come first. And in fact, at the end of the episode, we'll talk just a little bit about right now in the current Avengers storyline by Jason Aaron. Namor is a key character in that story, and he's very much the Namor who is opposed to the interests of the surface world. So it seems like Aaron's kind of going back to that more original template for the character, which I appreciate. Here's a quote from the great Peter Sanderson, who wrote one of my favorite Marvel-related history books, just called Marvel Universe. Like Tarzan, Namor was a natural man, a noble savage, unconfined by the rules and customs of Western society. Still, he clearly had classical motifs in mind. Murd, that's what you were talking about. Mm-hmm. Namor's name is Roman spelled backward. His pointed ears and exaggerated horn-like eyebrows and hairstyle gave him an impish appearance, reminiscent of Pan, the wild god who foments chaos and civilization. Namor's rampages make the gunfights of some of today's costume vigilantes in comics seem puny and restrained. And two great points there, Murd. You mentioned before how Namor seemed like a character from another time. Mm-hmm. I think that this quote nicely supports that. And when we talk about the violence surrounding Namor, now some of it's very cartoon-like because a lot of it's from the Golden Age period. But we're going to, when we get to the key moments in the character's history, there's a moment where he declares war on the entire world during World War II, feeling he's like the best person to kind of end all of it and then take control. He drowns Berlin. He destroys the German war machine. He takes all the water of the Mediterranean, so the Italian fleet is mud-bound. And then he launches an attack on Manhattan, and he floods the entire city. And we'll read the description of it when we get there. And anybody who's a fan of the classic Busiek-Ross Marvels miniseries from the 1990s, they reference that incident. And Ross's depiction of it is breathtaking.
Oh, yes.
So this is someone who... Here, you know what? Before I forget, when I was doing research, I always go to Marvel Wikia for certain character elements.
I usually end up there myself.
And this is a description that Marvel Wikia gives of Namor, because they always have like a blurb for each character, kind of like the essence of each character. So this is how they describe him: King of Atlantis and adventurer, former terrorist, warrior, commando, CEO, murderer. So I thought that was perfect because it captures the essence of how complex this character really is, and how when you're someone in his position, you're responsible for a whole nation, so to speak. People are going to see you in different ways, and you're going to play different roles in that capacity. So is he a hero? Is he a murderer? All of the above. That's what we're going to be discussing
Arguably,
here.
mass murderer, genocidist.
Yeah.
I mean, since do you have it in here in your notes that he actually destroyed an entire alternate Earth?
Yes. Well, that's recent history. We'll get into that very much.
Practically anti-monitor class mayhem.
Oh, before we go into more details, one more quote I have, it fittingly is from Namor's creator, Bill Everett, and this is a more lighthearted quote. Murr touches upon something you were joking about before. This is Everett speaking.
Mm-hmm.
I particularly love the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. I just thought that this being a submarine creature that could combine the two, the submarine and the mariner. So many kids just didn't know what a hyphen was.
Tragic.
They ignored the hyphen and put it all as one word and pronounced it submariner, because all they could think of was a submarine.
And really, who could blame them? Because in the late 1930s in the United States, submarines were all over the news.
Yes, they were.
But that doesn't excuse people nowadays from not knowing what a hyphen is, as indeed far too few of them do. I'm a staunch defender of that particular punctuation mark.
I figured you would, my friend. And as you mentioned, the submariner, whenever you see his name spelled out, that hyphen is always there. So we have to bear that in mind. Now, just to give an idea of where we're going. So we're going to do a quick publication checklist. So if anyone wants to pursue further reading, we'll give an idea of where you can go in terms of key appearances and various volumes of the Submariner character. We'll talk about his powers and various other aspects of the character, physically, mentally, etc. Again, Namor is one of the most powerful beings in the Marvel Universe. We're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about, and this is a key supporting player in the saga of the Submariner, which is Atlantis itself. Kind of like when you talk about Doctor Doom, you have to talk about Latveria. We talk about the Black Panther, you have to discuss Wakanda, because they're so intrinsic to the character.
Of course.
And with the Submariner, you have to talk about Atlantis. And Merv, this we're going to look forward to your contributions especially, because Atlantis, the Marvel version of Atlantis, we should say, has a very extensive history. So we're going to get into all that as best we can. And one of the tough things I found about researching Marvel's Atlantis, it's been in so many different spots, because they've moved the city due to a variety of reasons.
There have been so many colonies and outposts established as the Homo Mermanus people.
Yes.
Have been forced to move, or relocate, or just wander around for so many different reasons at so many different times over thousands of years of history that, well, it's no wonder they think of the entire ocean depths as their kingdom, because they've lived in most of it.
Pretty much. And we're going to talk about that as best we can. I mean, this is an overview, because you could do a whole episode really on just Marvel's version of Atlantis, essentially. And then we're going to talk about Namor's supporting cast, both key adversaries, key allies, their first appearances, the brief significance of each character. And then we're going to talk about just sort of an overview, not a checklist, an overview of Namor's history as a character, what some of the key events he's been involved in. Murderous mentioned the Incursion, which is a more recent development and a very important one. And we're also going to talk about the publishing history of the character, like where he came from, the role of Martin Goodman, the role of Bill Everett, of course, the creator of the character. And then we're going to end with talking a little bit about other media, and then finally about Bill Everett himself. And again, Bill Everett could easily have a whole episode or more devoted to him, because he's such a vitally important figure when it comes to the sort of the genesis of what we consider the American superhero comic. And also what I found is I've read about Bill Everett, not just recently but over the years, is that it seems like everybody liked him. I nary could find a bad word about the man from all the different creators whose quotes I read in various publications. And I'm always pleased to read about someone who, whatever the other faults might be, they feel like they're a really decent human being. And that's always a pleasure to read. All right, so we're going to start with the beginning. So when does the Submariner first appear? He doesn't appear technically in Marvel Comics #1. He first appears in let's call it an aborted promotional concept. Motion Picture Funnies Weekly #1. Now, this was produced by an organization called Funnies Incorporated. Now, I'm sure some of our more learned listeners who are versed in the history of the American comic book know what Funnies Incorporated was. It was one of the famous packagers or shops.
Right.
We did our Kirby spotlights in 2017. We talked at length about these. Basically, as many of the publishers started to realize, hey, there's some money in these comic books, they started to move away from publishing pulps, would have started to peter out in the 40s and 50s, and they started to move towards comics. But what the packagers did, Will Eisner, the Eisner Eiger shop, for example, where Kirby worked, was another famous packager.
Or the Harry A. Chesler shop. The A stood for anything, because that's what they provided their clients.
God, I love this guy. So the way the shops worked, they would hire artists who would then work for them, and they'd produce material. And then the salespeople for the shop would then sell that to the publisher. So the publisher didn't necessarily have artists directly working for them. Mm-hmm. They would farm it out to these shops, essentially. So Everett was working with Carl Burgos, the creator of the original Human Torch, for Funnies Incorporated. That company was run by a man. I may mispronounce his name. I apologize. Lloyd, I think it's Jacquet, something like that.
I think it's just jacket.
Okay,
like the garment.
All right. Well, Mr. Wethington, calling Mr. Wethington, please come to our aid. Indeed. So J.K. or Jacket came up with the idea of let's create a promotional book, black and white, and we're going to put it in movie theaters. I mean, it's the Depression, but everybody went to the movies in the Depression. It was one of those forms of cheap escapist entertainment that people thrived on in those years. Think of Wizard of Oz, King Kong, etc. And apparently, this promotional comic didn't go anywhere. Want to add something to that, Mert? Go ahead.
Yep, just couldn't get very many theater owners or managers interested. So I think they had plans for as many as 4 issues in the works, but the first one didn't even get entirely off the ground.
Correct.
Although they had at least printed a few copies to distribute as samples.
There were sample copies. I don't know if any of those are still in existence.
I think there must be a few. I mean, this comic could be completely forgotten for years, and apparently like 8 copies were discovered as part of Lloyd Jackett's estate after he died in 1974. And that was how this comic actually re-entered the knowledge of the comics academic institution.
And I don't have an Overstreet in front of me, but I can only imagine its value at this point.
It's incredibly rare, and it's also incredibly important because it's got the first appearance of this character, whom, as we've said, has meant so much to Marvel Comics history and comics history in general.
And essentially, it's the beginning of Marvel Comics.
Right, even before there was a Marvel,
exactly.
or a Timely Comics, for that matter.
Exactly. So that was aborted, as Mer just went into more detail on. But they kept the work, and they repackaged it into a new book, which they sold to Martin Goodman of, Magazine Management was his overarching company. We've talked many times in our history episodes about Goodman was a very shrewd, ruthless businessman, and he had all these different subdivisions, for tax shelter purposes, that produced, a variety of publications. Like what became Marvel Comics, or originally Timely, was only one part of his overall publishing empire, essentially. And so they sold to Goodman Marvel Comics #1, cover dated October 1939. Now, many listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with this cover. The cover wasn't actually drawn by Burgos or Bill Everett. It was, I guess, kind of show the transition that Goodman was still kind of straddling both worlds, pulp and comics. He had the it's a striking cover image done by a famous pulp artist of the time. Let me get his name here.
Frank R. Paul.
Thank you, Murd. Well done. Frank R. Paul. And, of course, Marvel Comics, like many of the early superhero comics, wasn't just one character. You had the Angel by Paul Gustafson, not the X-Men Angel, of course.
Right.
Go ahead, Murd.
Kind of a classic 40s costumed hero called his real name was renowned surgeon Thomas Halloway. And he was kind of a two-fisted vigilante who became part of Marvel continuity years later as the founder of the Scourge organization.
Yes, and I highly recommend by Brubaker, the Magnificent Marvels Project, which came out several years ago, where they go in and they really use the Angel and other characters from this era.
Yep, some of whom hadn't been seen in years.
Yes, wonderfully done. So Angel appears, Ben Thompson does Kazar. Now, Kazar had already actually appeared as a pulp character.
And this is, again, not the same Kazar as
Yes.
would later be a part of Marvel's Silver Age. Completely different character. His real name was David Rand, and he had adventures in Africa, as opposed to the Savage Land that we all know today.
So it's the same name. That's basically where
Yeah,
that
and as you
stops.
said, Chris, he had been a pulp character, and I think that was just Goodman kind of hedging his bets a little bit by including some of his old pulp concepts.
We have to remember one thing about Goodman's business strategy is he wasn't really an innovator, but he was very canny when it came to identifying trends, and he would often flood the market. Oh, now it's cowboys. I want 30 cowboy comics, basically. I'm exaggerating here a little bit, and sometimes that would work out for him, other times it wouldn't. But on balance, it was very effective for him in terms of his profit margin to not to innovate, but just to copy and then flood the market. So pulps were starting to die out, and he starts to make this. He puts his toe in the water now with Marvel Comics #1. So that's where the Submariner and the android Human Torch first appear. Now, Everett, of course, was the creator, the scripter, and the artist. But he completely created the character. That no one else was involved. It was totally his creation. I'm going to read a quote here from Everett about that period. This is from, again, let me just do a quick little shout-out to Tomorrow's. I couldn't do any of these Spotlight episodes without Tomorrow's, all the various magazines and hardcover books, specialized books that deal with different creators and characters. It's just a wealth of history when it comes to the American comic book. If you love this type of topic, do yourself a favor. Go on their website. Just start ordering stuff. You will be instantly gratified once you receive them. So this is from Alter Ego number 22. And this is an interview from 1970 where Gil Kane and Neil Adams were interviewing Bill Everett and Joe Kubert. So this is in Everett's own words. Let's see. Here we are. I'm only recently beginning to learn, this is Everett, that there was more to my writing of the Submariner than I actually thought at the time. This is him speaking in 1970. He was an angry character, and I probably expressed some of my own personality. But again, at least in the Origin of the Submariner, in the beginning of it, I was allowed full expression. There were no limitations set by editors, no limitations set by publishers, no limitations set by anyone, art directors or others. And this was a case where an artist or an artist-writer could freely express himself. And if you had something to tell which was worthwhile, this was an outlet for it. Unfortunately, business was very good at the time, and we didn't realize what it would eventually lead to. A great many of us could have done more with it had we had the foresight. We didn't. And that little sort of wistful note there at the end is just a reminder of how most of his creators do not really benefit from their creation. This is the work for hire era, and as Everett is saying there, this was disposable entertainment. Nobody thought this was going to become these very lucrative properties. And he's speaking in 1970. This is long before Marvel movies, and all that other stuff. And even then, he and other creators like Kirby realized, we're losing out here. We're not making what we cut off our creations. Again, that's one of the many really very sad, tragic aspects of this part of the American comic books history. Now, that first issue, so it's the first appearance of the Submariner, whose real name is Namor Mackenzie. Remember, Namor is a hybrid. He is born of an Atlantean mother and a surface-dwelling father. The first appearance of Princess Fen, who was Namor's mother. Dorma, a cousin who will later become one of the great loves of his life.
And I think that must be, the story from Motion Picture Funnies Weekly was, some of the sources I've read tell me, expanded by 4 pages, from 8 to 12 pages when it was included in Marvel #1. And I think that Dorma must have been in one of those extra 4 pages, because...
You're correct, Murr, because when I did the research, like they give Namor's first appearance as Motion Picture Funnies Weekly, Dorma, they say Marvel Comics #1.
There we
she
go.
Probably was added in. Thakor, who is the Emperor, and although he's not named in that first appearance, Leonard Mackenzie, who is Namor's human father.
Actually? Hate to contradict you there, Chris, but
Please.
he actually is. I'm pointing to the page right there. It's a reprint of that famous first story in an Invaders #20 from
Bird?
the sensational 70s. But yeah, so he's not shown on panel, but his mother Fen is wistfully reminiscing about the love affair with this man that led to Namor's birth, which happened in 1920. The date that tells us. So Namor's only 19 as of the time his first story appeared, an angry youth, and so yeah, that's we do learn his human father's name. But Thakor, meanwhile, he's not named in the story.
Correct.
In fact, we don't know that he's Namor's grandfather either. Namor just refers to him as Holy One because he's the current emperor of the Undersea Empire.
Murd, I love when you prove me wrong. Outstanding.
Don't
for the common good.
I don't like to do it often, Chris.
Oh, it's much appreciated.
As long as it's done with respect and restraint, it can be fun to do once in a while.
Are you kidding? I can only imagine how many mistakes are in some of these episodes. It's always good to have, again, that invaluable co-pilot. Now, a couple interesting points about this first issue. They don't use the term Atlantis. And in reading interviews with Everett, he said, he said, I was thinking about Atlantis, but, I didn't. He consciously did not call it Atlantis, but obviously that was an inspiration. Other interesting point is that Namor doesn't look like the rest of his people, especially in these early appearances.
Right, because his people kind of look like fish.
Yes.
They're blue-skinned, bug-eyed. They've got these catfish whiskers. Some of them do. It's They look very much inhuman.
Yeah, I mean, Fen looks more like a humanoid woman, because otherwise why would Mackenzie be attracted to her?
Right. She was chosen specifically for her resemblance to surface females to be sent forth as a spy.
Right.
That are exact words. She was sent to basically seduce somebody up there to gain some information.
What was happening is Mackenzie's... so when we first meet what will later be called Atlantis, it's not in the Atlantic Ocean. It's not in the South Pacific. It's in the Arctic. It's near Antarctica.
Right.
Okay. And his ship is an icebreaker, and they're using explosives to break through the ice. That causes damage to the undersea kingdom. So like you said, they send Fen up to investigate, and she's on the ship for some weeks, and she and Mackenzie have a whirlwind romance, and they fall for each other, and they get married, and she's impregnated, and then Thakor sends up warriors to find out what happened to his daughter. They wipe out the crew. You think Mackenzie is killed. He's not. He returns later on. We'll talk about that. And she returns to the deep, but now she's carrying this surface dweller's child. Now, Murd, I wanted to ask you, and again, when we talk about a character that's been around this long, there's a lot of retro continuity that goes on here. So now Marvel routinely refers to Namor as their first mutant. Okay? What's your reaction to that? What's your take on that?
Well, I don't think it's entirely unjustified. I mean, it's something that it came up in the 60s, mainly because, the mutant factions that were warring in the comics at that time wanted to try and recruit Namor to their respective causes. It was kind of downplayed for a bit by certain writers in the 70s, describing him more as a hybrid than as a true mutant. But then when mutants came back into vogue, all of a sudden, hey, Namor is a mutant after all.
And if you recall the Byrne volume called Namor the Submariner, they would have that blurb on the cover because they wanted to cash in on the mutant phrase.
Yep, that was the banner. Yep. Marvel's first mutant.
So, but if you look at Namor, he doesn't look like any of his people, nor does he look like surface people either, right? Now, the way Everett first drew him is radically different than Namor we're accustomed to from the Marvel age, so to speak. He's got almost that pointed triangular head. As like the one quote we read, I think it was from Sanderson. The pan-like visage, the pointy ears, the arched eyebrows. He's not a surface person, but he's not really an Atlantean either in the sense of looking like them. And as we get into the Silver Age, the Atlanteans look humanoid, but they're blue, and of course they have gills behind their ears so they can breathe underwater. Namor is light-skinned. Namor has those ankle wings, which I think is a great visual, though it doesn't make any sense in terms of physics, but who cares? It's comics.
Right.
And, he can breathe on the surface and underwater. So, and Everett establishes that right away, that he's like an other in a sense, even in his own world, so to speak.
So I think one of the sources I consulted, I'm sorry, I can't remember if it was Gerard Jacobs or Gerard Jones's The Comic Book Heroes or Les Daniels' Marvel book, but theorized that one of the reasons he's so desperate, he's so insistent on leading and being the most devoted emperor of his, or leader of his people that he can be, is because he's worried. He's sort of sublimating the idea that he doesn't belong anywhere, not only among his own people, but among his father's surface people either. He's a man of two worlds and therefore a man of neither.
I think that goes to the very heart of the character and what makes the character so compelling. Now let's talk a little bit about that first appearance. So you've read the story, Merge. So what does Namor do right off the bat, which establishes, whoa, this is not Superman?
He kills a couple of guys. Very first story, just
Poor
a couple
salvage divers.
Yeah, they just weren't really harming anything. They were just poking around an undersea wreck that Namor had included as a part of his teenage stomping grounds, and he mistook them for robots.
Yeah.
And that's how they kind of excuse it. But he doesn't realize he's killing human beings. He thinks he's killing probe robots that have been sent down by a ship up above. And then he proceeds to wreck the ship. We don't see what happens to the crew, but presumably they might have suffered a lethal fate of sorts. But then he takes the robots back and presents them to Thakor at the throne room of the Atlantean colony where he's living down there in Antarctica. And then he takes off their helmets and he's like, oh, I killed two people. What have I done? And then his mother shows up and congratulates him. And he said, why, mother? What? So he has some compunctions about killing these two guys, but they're still dead. But so the blood is kind of on his hands from the beginning, but at least he feels somewhat bad about it.
And what does he cut the air hose of one of them, and he crushes the helmet of the other? It's violent. Like what I love about this story is, and I don't know how conscious Everett was when he was doing that. I'm assuming he must have been to some degree. This is a very different type of comic book protagonist, in terms, because we've already got Superman by this point. Batman's right after this, right around the same time.
Batman came in sometime between Motion Picture Funnies Weekly and Marvel Comics #1. I think it was spring of 1939, and the Marvel Comics was October.
And Everett's already done a character like Amazing Man, which he did earlier for Centaur Publications. Mm-hmm. So costume heroes are beginning to appear. Go back to Siegel and Schuster. What was the character they did before Superman? I always forget the name.
Dr. Occult.
Dr. Occult, right. So there's been some presence here, but this is very different. This is, and Batman will kill some people early on in his career. Of course,
he certainly did. Yes, the purple-gloved Batman was even carried a gun at times.
Yes, but as we read in that one quote, what Namor is going to do when he really gets rolling here is leaves all these other guys in the dust when it comes to actually taking life. But again, this is not a superhero in that sense. This is a political figure. This is a monarch. This is someone who is in charge of a country, a nation, a world, so to speak. Now, one thing I want to point out was interesting about the creative aspect of this book. If you look at that first appearance, Everett consciously tried to mimic an undersea environment in the art. And I'm going to read here a description of that where he talks about it. This is Everett speaking now. I wanted to get a sort of a third-dimensional or a painting type effect rather than the flat black and white and color. We used what is known as a craft tint board, which is chemically treated, an illustration board, in which you use chemicals that bring out cross-hatching for tonal value. And we thought this might be a very good idea to get grays into it, to get particularly the feeling of water, of depth underwater. If you look at, now he then goes on to talk about how the printer really couldn't handle what he wanted. But if you look at those first few issues, you can clearly see his effort there to try to create that effect for the reader, that this is happening underwater. Again, Bill Everett was a tremendous artist, ladies and gentlemen. He already had extensive experience in advertising, technical art, things like that. So this is not just some piker who just came off the boat and started trying to draw a comic book. This is someone who already had extensive experience. And like a lot of these guys, he got into comics because he wasn't getting as much work in other areas of illustration. He decided to give this a try, and we're all fortunate for it.
Indeed.
So, in that first issue, doesn't it end with Fenn encouraging his son to go and wage war in the surface world, essentially?
Yep. And the final words of the story are, and so Namor, the avenging son, see that epithet was a part of him from the start, faces the surface men of the world in what promises to be mortal combat.
Yes. And remember, avenging son is what Namor's name is supposed to mean in Atlantean.
Right.
Essentially. Now, So let me talk a little bit about sort of Namor's publication checklist. We can't go into everything in detail because that's you could have a whole series of podcasts on just the Submariner. So for further reading, again, go to the original Marvel Comics, which with issue 2, and Goodman often did this. He would change titles, probably to draw new interest from readers on the newsstand.
Hedging his bets yet again. A title that would be more appropriate to his tried and true pulp magazines.
Exactly. So he changed the name to Marvel Mystery Comics.
Right.
And Namor and the Human Torch and the Angel and other characters will appear in that book now for some time. I couldn't find in my research when Namor stopped appearing in Marvel Mystery Comics. I can't answer that off the top of my head.
Maybe I can. Number 91. All the way, that's 2 issues before the series ceased to be Marvel Mystery Comics and became the horror anthology Marvel Tales.
Now, ladies and gentlemen.
It's 1949.
I've said this before, and I'm happy to be redundant because he deserves it. I'm in that foxhole. I'm in that dugout. And we're going to be overrun. Who do you want by your side? Adam Murdo. Outstanding.
Happy to be your backstop as always, Chris.
Now, almost concurrently, because the Submariner obviously was doing quite well, so within 2 years he got his own book. And we have to emphasize how rare that really was initially for characters to be featured in their own title. A lot of them were given these tryouts, these anthology-type comics. And as you mentioned, Merton, he was in that for 91 issues. So obviously he was gaining a lot of popularity and doing well for them to put him in his own book, less than 2 years later. So in 1941, we have Submariner Comics, and that ran issues 1 through 32. That ended in 1949. Now, Murdo will be familiar with this, as many of our listeners. There was, after the war, reading tastes were changing, and superheroes weren't as popular as they had been during the real height of the Golden Age, late 30s into the early and mid-40s. So a lot of characters were getting canceled, or their books were changing to other titles. We always talk about how, the great Roy Thomas, he subscribed to Justice Society, and I think when he got the book, they changed it to like a Western comic or something like that. That happened all the time. And a lot of the heroes went away for a period of time. Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, they remained. And, of course, Aquaman remained as a backup of Green Arrow, and was it Adventure Comics, I think?
I think so.
Captain Marvel, Shazam from Fawcett, once that company, A, they were dealing with that lawsuit from DC. B, as sales started to peak and then drop, they just ended that. So Namor's canceled in 1949. Now, he's then revived in 1954. This is when the real Red Scare, the second Red Scare in the Cold War, from issues 33 to 42. Everett comes back, and he does some of those stories. You just mentioned one that you read. Mm-hmm. He does some of those stories as well. And that's the the Captain America Commie Smash era, where they brought back in the book Young Men. They brought back Captain America, the Android Human Torch, and the Submariner. And I've read quotes with Everett where he was a little unhappy because, he needed the work, but the Submariner he created, it really wasn't the same character. Well, now they had him fighting like smugglers, common ne'er-do-wells, and, of course, communists.
Oh, naturally.
So, and Stan Lee, to his credit, tried to bring these characters back. And John Romita Sr. did some of those Captain America stories, for example, from the 1950s. But it didn't take. And as you can see, Namor only had a brief revival run, issues 33 to 42.
Still did much better than either Cap or the Torch did, because they only lasted about 3 issues each.
That's true.
Namor, 10.
Yep. Again, we have to imagine there's still plenty of people reading books back then who probably remember the character fondly from the late 30s and the 1940s. We should point out now, so how does Namor appear at this point? So, not like the Submariner you're familiar with now. He often wears these nondescript trunks, black, with like a stripe down the side. When he returns in the 50s, there's an issue where, look at my notes here, where you first see the sort of the more famous scaled trunks or briefs. I'm just going into this because when we think of the Submariner having a costume, there really isn't much there. It's a guy, swimming underwater.
Right.
But they do give him like scaled blue trunks, which are a little more dynamic. And then you have they actually have him wear green trunks at one point. I'm looking at it right here, actually. He has blue scaled trunks in Young Men 24, 1953, when he returns. Then he goes back to black trunks with a yellow stripe, and then in issue 27, Young Men, he has green scaled trunks, then blue. Now, when he returns in the Silver Age, and he first appears in Fantastic Four number 4, where you want to give a little background on how the character, what state the character's in Fantastic Four number 4?
Well, he's amnesiac.
Yes.
Yes, he seems somewhat prone to amnesia, because this won't be the last time he suffers from it. But yeah, for several years, and the number of years has kind of varied, what with the flexible chronology of the Marvel Universe. But sometime between the mid-50s and whenever the Marvel Silver Age actually begins in real time, he's kind of...
I think they say decades now at this point. He's been wandering.
Yeah, and another virtue of his hybrid/mutant constitution is that he's very long-lived. He ages very slowly. But yeah, he suffered... there's a cataclysm. We eventually learn the nature of that cataclysm.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, but because of that, he goes amnesiac and just kind of wanders for a time. We learn in the John Byrne and Roger Stern collaboration, Marvel: The Lost Generation, which is a 12-issue maxi series that's supposed to show us some things that happened in the Marvel Universe between the end of the Golden Age and the beginning of the Marvel Silver Age. And somewhere in there, we do see a glimpse of Namor during his amnesiac period, probably early on, and he's wearing those red trunks.
Yes.
That he has later on, and he's in the service of some villain or other. But eventually he just kind of wanders around and finds his way to the Bowery
In a flop house.
in New York City, yes, where Johnny Storm checks in for the night and finds this bearded, long-haired guy who has the strength, mysterious super strength, but he also has the classical features semi-buried beneath all the follicles of Namor the Submariner. He also happened to be reading a few old Namor comics just before this revelation, just as by way of foreshadowing. And so he uses his flaming finger to burn away.
Absolute control. Just burns away the hair. That's it.
Yes, Norelco could take a lesson. Burns away the extra hair and the beard, and there's Namor. Namor himself is still not convinced that the kid isn't some raving lunatic, so the kid, in perfectly sane fashion, takes this unfortunate derelict and throws him into the harbor.
I don't know if he can actually swim or not. But
Right.
that's all right.
Taking kind of a gamble, but as it turns out, his hunch was correct, and the contact with the salt water restores Namor's memories, and he flies back out again, is restored to his old imperious, his retconned new old imperious self, because as we've said, Stan Lee's personality for Namor is not quite the same as what he'd had under other pens during the 40s and 50s.
Yes. And kudos to Lee and Kirby for bringing back this character. Again, a lot of the Golden Age concepts, characters, they're brought back in like the Vision, for example, was a Simon and Kirby creation, which then Roy Thomas, Lee and Roy Thomas modified and took in a different direction. But they acknowledge the history, they acknowledge what came before, and then they worked it into this new world they were creating, so to speak. Now, if you read further, sometimes it seems, and it's a little hazy, but in some cases, it seems like some of this stuff was being done to protect Martin Goodman legally when it came to ownership of certain characters. That may have definitely been the case with the Human Torch. That's a whole other discussion. But again, we always have to remember that this is a business. It's not just a creative endeavor. And that's kind of that quote I read before from Everett. It was kind of lamenting the more parasitic business side of it when it came to how that dealt with creators. And we always have to bear that in mind. I was telling right off the air that I was reading an interview with Carl Burgos' daughter in another issue of Alter Ego, number, look at it right here actually, number 49. She talks about how she came home one day and her father was in the backyard burning all of his Human Torch comics. Ugh. And, she said her father didn't speak much about his work and his career. He was a very taciturn man when it came to that. But apparently he was involved in some kind of legal dispute with Marvel that he had lost to try to regain ownership of that character. So whether they were brought back for litigious reasons or creativity or a combination of the two, we as readers in many cases did benefit. Certainly we benefited when it came to Submariner. Now, we should also mention, of course, again, in terms of a reading primer, Avengers number 4. The Submariner is now fully revived and raging, and of course, as many listeners know, he will discover the entombed, frozen form of Steve Rogers in the ice. He's incensed that some Inuit people what they used to call Eskimos back then, are worshiping this frozen person as a deity, and he throws it into the ocean, and then Cap is restored, and that's we all know that story. So
yes, and it wouldn't be until years later when Namor is finally made aware of the role he played in Cap's return.
That's true, indeed. We can also look at Tales to Astonish. This is where Submariner gets his first solo series in the new Marvel Universe, starting with issue 70, 1965, through issue 101, when that title then ends. Again, Tales to Astonish, one of the Marvel house books. So that and Strange Tales, Tales of Suspense, Journey into Mystery, all were a way for Goodman to get around that very unfortunate distribution deal he had with Independent News, which was DC's distributor.
Which prevented him from having more than a certain number of magazines on the shelves at a time.
Because they were trying to prevent him from flooding the market again, as he used to do. So we've talked about that story in many other episodes. Basically, only print 8 titles a month. So he would cram 2 characters into one of these books to maximize the number of characters he could put on the stands. And that's where Namor has a lot of his early Silver Age adventures. That book then ends, and then for 1 month in 1968, they have a segue title, Iron Man and Submariner #1.
A one-shot.
One-shot, yep.
Not often done in those days.
No, not at all. We should mention Gene Colan is doing a lot of Submariner penciling in this period.
Oh, definitely.
And again, I'm a huge Colan fan. His Submariner, much more physically imposing, far more muscular, very dynamic. Everett's original Submariner is more that Pan-like figure.
Elfin, sprite-like, etc.
This is a overpowering monarch of the Seven Seas, essentially. I mean, I love them both, but it's just tomato, it's a matter of taste. Then when Marvel finally shucks free of DC's distribution chains, they explode. They all the characters that were in these house books, now most of them are given their own titles. And Namor gets his own book in 1968, the classic John Buscema cover, no doubt many listeners are familiar with. That's the Submariner. That runs for 72 issues into the Bronze Age. Then there's a Submariner miniseries in 1984, issues 1 through 4. And this is a love of Roy Thomas. I was just reading a quote by him on this. The saga of the Submariner from 1988, 1 through 12, where Thomas takes you through the whole sort of Golden Age, Atom Age history of the character. It's like kind of him again. Roy Thomas, one of the great champions of the Golden Age, of the Atom Age, and the creators therein. And this is one of his love letters, where he sort of revisits the entire history of the Submariner, kind of sort of updates it for the Marvel. I've never read this miniseries. Have you read it? I'm
fortunate enough to have issues 7 through 12, not the first 6, which would have been most useful, actually, I think. But yeah, they're part of. I've owned them for years, and until researching this episode, I really never bothered to crack them open. But they were part of a paper grocery bag full of comics that my dad brought back from a yard sale sometime within my first year or two of collecting. And having looked at them now, I mean, they were written by Roy and his frequent collaborator and muse, his then wife, Dan Thomas.
Still his wife, yep.
Still is?
Yep.
Okay, good. I thought I'd read somewhere that they'd split. But
that was his first wife.
Okay. And art by Rich Buckler and a variety of inkers, including Bob McLeod. And yeah, so 12 issues, and the first 6 issues, it takes just the first 6 issues just to get through the golden and atomic ages, the 40s and 50s. It's issue number 7, which is the first issue I happen to own, is where we pick up with Fantastic Four number 4 and the encounter with the Human Torch at the Bowery Flophouse. And it's all carefully annotated, of course. Roy breaks down the sources in the letters page. And in addition to that, he also treats us to a one-on-one interview that Roy the Boy himself had with Bill Everett.
Yes.
Which was published originally in an Alter Ego magazine issue from 1978, although it was conducted several years before that, obviously because Everett died in 1973.
And in fact, Mert, I'm glad you mentioned that, because if you want to go into tomorrow's site and order or get the digital copy of Alter Ego number 46 from March 2005, they reprint that interview. Because what some listeners may not be aware of is that when Bill Everett returned to comics and to Marvel in the Silver Age, for a time, he roomed with Roy Thomas. They were roommates in an apartment. So you can imagine, I mean, because Roy Thomas was a Golden Age enthusiast. Now he's rooming with one of the architects of the entire Golden Age, which must have been incredibly thrilling for him. But yeah, so that interview it's a great interview. I just read it last night as part of my research to kind of bone up a little bit. It is also in Alter Ego number 46.
Well, I'm glad that Saga gave me access to a few excerpts from that.
Well done.
Yeah, and it does a fantastic, that's 12-issue miniseries, does a fantastic job of just going through so many years of disparate storytelling and sewing them together into a coherent
Which no one
whole.
does better than Roy Thomas.
Oh, yes, it's been a specialty of his for a long time.
Yeah.
He's like a true retconnoisseur
Yes.
of the comics medium.
Well, and always respecting the source material and the history. This series, if you go to a show or store with a great selection of bargain bins, you can find this series in cheap bins. It shouldn't be expensive. And I've never read it. I owned it several times as a retailer, but I'm sorry I just never read it. But what you're telling me, Murray, doesn't surprise me one bit, considering Roy Thomas is involved in it.
Yeah, it's a great breakdown of the first 50 years of the Submariner, published in 1989, already 30 years gone by.
Yes. We're getting older, my friend.
Yes, I'm afraid we are.
The next book is, Murray's mentioned it before, is Namor the Submariner from 1990. Now, this is the John Byrne. He started this. Remember, John Byrne, both DC and Marvel have sort of used John Byrne. Let's think of him as like a creative firefighter. If they feel the character is sort of ebbing or has been derailed, they'll bring Byrne in, and they want him to sort of rejuvenate the character. You saw this with the Fantastic Four. You saw this with Superman. You saw this with Wonder Woman. And Marvel also has him, She-Hulk, and Marvel has him do it with Namor the Submariner as well. Whether or not you're a Byrne fan, I'll leave that up to listeners, but I know Jamie D was a big fan of this series.
Oh, yes, he talked it up many times, and thanks to his encouragement, I did put it on my long-term list of series I want to collect, but I don't have so many issues of it so far.
I've only read bits and pieces of it, but what I can tell you from the reading I've done and also research is that Byrne takes the character some interesting new directions, and as we mentioned, he's also going to tackle why is the Submariner always so prone to belligerence, being belligerent, and to losing his temper and being sort of this rage being in a sense. We'll get into that a little bit later. Then you have the miniseries Namor from 2003, issues 1 through 12. Now, was this the one where he's a kid?
Yeah, it's
What's
set
that
in,
imprint that Marvel
set in
did?
his youth. I wasn't, or at least it wasn't originally a part of whatever imprint you're thinking of.
Yeah.
It was just a Marvel series.
Yeah.
It was co-written by Bill Jemas and Andy Watson of Skeleton Key. The art was by Salvador LaRocca. And it was supposed to be set sometime in the late 20s, I believe, although I don't think very much period research went into it, which kind of soured me on the book right out of the starting gate, to be honest. It was supposed to be like young Namor making his first encounters with the surface world, with young love and all that sort of
I read it. I'll talk about it a little bit because it has been retconned into Namor's history. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Then you have a 6-issue miniseries, Submariner from 2007. A story I particularly like is Submariner The Depths from 2008, issues 1 through 5. This is by the great team of Peter Milligan and Esad Ribic.
Ooh.
Beautiful artwork. And I think of it almost as, what if the Submariner were real in our world? And it's about call him a myth buster, a scientist who tries to disprove superstitions and myths. And he leads a crew of submariners. They go in a submarine to try to disprove the existence of Atlantis. And the story, the art is amazing. It's all in the dark in the sub, and how crew members start to die or go insane. And the scientist starts to wonder, is the Submariner real? Because the crew speaks to the Submariner as if he's like a mythical being, like a chimera. And the scientist is like, no, he's not real. It's, this is your imagination. And as you read more in the book, you realize not only is he real, this is not our Namor. This is a terrifying apparition that human beings are not meant to encounter.
So this is not mainstream Marvel continuity.
No, but I highly recommend it. It's excellent. And then, of course, Namor the First Mutant. There's that mutant label.
Yep, leaning into that X-gene connection a little bit
2010, issues 1 through 11. And this is where they also establish, again, retcon, that Namor has a sort of relationship with Emma Frost that goes back a bit as well. So that's like a key publication checklist. What I have not put in there are the gazillion appearances of Namor in other books.
Mm-hmm. His membership in various teams.
He's been an Avenger. He's been the Invaders is a whole other discussion, a whole other episode, really. The All Winners Squad. The Defenders, a founding member. I mean, He's been all over the Marvel Universe.
He was an Avenger for a number of years
Yes,
there in
he
the
was.
80s.
Yep. So, and again, and in the current storyline going on in Avengers now, which I won't spoil because Mert hasn't read it yet, but they've always established, the better writers are conscious of the history, that one of the few surface people that Namor will at least give pause to is Captain America. And that he will at least talk to, because there's that respect, essentially. I mean, there's an issue of the Avengers, I don't remember the number, where Namor was raging, or he was making an ass out of himself in some public situation, and Steve just glares at him, and Namor just kind of drops his head sheepishly and stops.
Oh.
So there's that I don't know if it's a bond, but there's a bond forged through years of war and comradeship, but also there's that grudging respect. Anything you want to talk about my friend before I go on to powers?
Oh, I think we can transition to powers at this point.
All right. So, and this is where Marvel Wiki is especially helpful, as is like old books like the classic Grunwald Handbook of the Marvel Universe. So, Namor is what they call an alpha-level mutant, in that he is one of the most powerful beings on the planet in the Marvel Universe. He's acknowledged as a mutant. So, he's a hybrid of what we call the Homo Mermanus, which are the Atlantean undersea humanoids, essentially, and all their various offshoots and other, like Atuma, he's like another tribe that was exiled. And all
Atlantean
this kind of
is
It's
an
a
imperfect
catch-all.
demonym because it names specifically people who are members of that undersea nation state,
Yes.
as opposed to other members of the race who don't define themselves as
Correct.
citizens, such as you just mentioned, Atuma and his nomad barbarians.
Exactly.
So Homo Mermanus is like the biological designation.
Indeed. So remember, Namor's a hybrid of Homo Mermanus and Homo Superior, because we have to assume that Leonard Mackenzie had a mutant gene in him. I'm just making a educated guess there, as much as you can when you're talking about fantasy.
Right.
And as Murd mentioned, in the '90s, it was trendy to refer to Namor as that selling point as Marvel's first mutant. I guess technically, could say maybe Apocalypse is actually Marvel's first mutant.
Well,
but
publication,
Yeah.
in terms of publication chronology, not in-universe chronology.
Indeed.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. Apocalypse probably would have that honor otherwise.
And of course, his ankle wings, his flight ability, that like the Atlanteans don't have that. Humans don't. On the surface don't have that. That's a key. That's very emblematic of his mutation,
Yep.
essentially.
Excellent point, Chris.
Now, Namor, unlike his people, can survive on land or underwater. Now, Atlanteans, because they have to deal with water pressure, naturally are stronger than surface humans. But Namor is far stronger than any other Atlantean. Like, he is in a total class by himself. No Atlantean can really take him, I think, in physical combat, essentially. He's far more powerful than any of them. All Atlanteans have gills behind their ears, so that's why you never actually see gills on them when they draw them, which allow them to breathe underwater. But unlike the Atlanteans, who eventually, when we get to the Marvel Silver Age, they're blue-skinned humanoids. They're not like the greenish fish, anthropomorphic fish people, right? And of course, and all Atlanteans can see underwater. Their bodies can adjust to the pressure and the temperatures. But Namor is far beyond that. Again, he can go toe to toe with the Thing and the Hulk, and has on more than one occasion. And walked away, survived to tell the tale. He can lift thousands of tons. He's one of the strongest beings in the Marvel Universe. So when we talk about like that Omega level strength, obviously the Hulk is in a class by himself.
Strongest one there is.
But then you have it's the Thing, it's Thor, it's Submariner. These are all like the real heavy hitters when it comes to sheer physical power. According to Marvel Wiki, Namor can swim up to 345 miles per hour. His body is not invulnerable, but close to it. He can withstand bullets, energy blasts, explosions, blows from superpowered beings. He can survive falls from orbit, extreme temperature changes. Murd, I wanted to ask you about this. My research said that he can telepathically communicate with marine life. Is that true?
It's the kind of thing that
Or does
tends
that
to be.
come in and out depending on the writer, basically?
Yeah, it's not on the same level as Aquaman's aquatic telepathy. So it's more like a an empathic sensitivity or link. It's something that actually did come up in a couple of the Golden Age stories, but was sort of forgotten about come the 60s. And we might as well throw in here while we're talking about power sets, or elements of the power set that have been forgotten or de-emphasized. There were a couple of stories in Strange Tales, which is always kind of continuity adjacent, a little questionable even in the 60s. There were a couple of Submariner stories there, written by Stan Lee and his brother Larry, and with art by Dick Ayers. Issue 107 and again in 125 when Namor showed up. And used
Human Torch stories.
Yeah. Exactly. The Human Torch, and by 125, the Human Torch and Thing strip that was running in Strange Tales. He exhibited fish-derived superpowers, like the abilities of the electric eel. And at one point, he actually inflated himself like a blowfish.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So these are stories that the powers that were used once and pretty much agreed, even by Roy Thomas, that should be allowed to lapse from the collective memory. Yeah, he mentioned that in one of the letter calls of Saga of the Submariner. He said that he chose to ignore that rather than explain it. And you know how Roy loves to explain everything he can. That was too stupid even for him to deal with.
That's a good point, though, because when we think of Aquaman, you know, it's intrinsic to that character that he can telepathically communicate with sea life. I never associated that with Submariner. So when I read that, I was like, I don't recall ever seeing that at all. But you just verified, as I knew you would, that. And this is typical of characters that have been around for decades. There's always powers that we just kind of not going to pretend that ever happened. They kind of shush it off to the side. It's just not there anymore. Right. So, when we talked about our Thor spotlight, I remember there's a period of time where couldn't he travel through time, and they got rid of that power.
Yes, but they got rid of it in an in-story way.
Right? Yeah.
It involved Immortus.
Right.
Which was later referenced in Avengers Forever.
Oh.
Yeah, but so they didn't just forget about that. They did take the trouble to write a in-story excuse for why he doesn't have that complication to his powers.
That was a rare thing to do that back in that time period, to kind of explain away a power like that.
Well, I think it was the 70s by then. So it was
the 70s?
It was becoming less rare by then.
Fair enough.
Yeah, Thor just hadn't thought to use that time travel power of his for some time by then.
Professor Murdo. Office hours are posted.
As
long as you don't have to return papers. Let me tell you, Murdo, those are a bitch.
Right.
I got a pile I have to read shortly. So it's ankle wings. So apparently can fly at speeds faster than aircraft. Now, of course, if you're a Submariner fan, one of the sort of the lovable jokes is, how do these things possibly work in any way, shape, or form? Again, it's comics. Don't worry about it. They're these little wings that, one theory is they kind of help in terms of his direction when he's flying. They're like a directional aid, something like that.
And his actual ability to fly is probably from some other superhuman source. He can manipulate gravitons or something.
But it looks cool.
Yeah.
So that's all that matters. All right. Namor, of course, is a master hand-to-hand combatant, not someone you want to tussle with. And again, because he's a king, he's also a military and political strategist. Like, this is not some guy who's he's not a bonehead. He's not, he's a highly experienced warlord and general and political leader. Mm-hmm. And you see that, like, I'll go back to my beloved Christopher Priest Black Panther run. In the Storm and Drang storyline we've talked about, which is one of the highlights of that series, they show you Namor as a political leader, negotiating with Doom, negotiating with T'Challa, negotiating with Magneto.
Right.
So
all the superhuman heads of state come together in that story, which is as excellent as you've always said it is, Chris.
I'm glad you enjoyed it, my friend. So, again, a complex character, to say the least. Now, one little interesting retcon, this is by Byrne. I think this is fascinating. So, in the Namor the Submariner story, Namor, I think it's after Atlantis attacks.
I think so, yeah.
He's presumed dead. He ends up adrift in the South Pacific, and he's found by a marine biologist named, I think it's Caleb Alexander, and his daughter, Carrie.
Sounds familiar.
And they pluck him out of the sea, and, they help restore him. And Caleb, through his knowledge, realizes that, hey, Namor, you have an oxygen imbalance. Like, if you're out of the water too long, or if you're away from land too long, it creates like almost like a bipolar effect in your brain, and that's why you have these bouts of uncontrollable rage. So this is Byrne's take on why Namor has that often very thorny aspect to his personality. So it's one of the interesting aspects of that volume of the Submariner's publishing history. Are we familiar with this?
This is the first time I'd heard about it, but
Okay.
I'm fascinated by the concept, Chris. It's a great... I got to give some credit to Byrne for that. That's a great storytelling device, a great retcon explanation for Namor's frequent mood swings and reorientation from roles of hero and villain. And,
mass murderer to, savior and so forth. So.
And he ties it in beautifully to his man of two worlds aspect.
Yep.
Anytime he spends too much time in any one of those two worlds, he ends up behaving kind of villainous for a while.
So so again, go to... I don't know if those are in trade or not right now. I have to look that up. But again, they're going to be cheap in bargain bins too, that series. Mm-hmm. And the bits and pieces of it I've read, we'll talk more about it in a little bit, really well done.
Yeah, especially the first 30 or so issues, which Byrne at least wrote and in many cases drew.
That's what we get into the whole him as a CEO. We'll get into all that in a little bit. Now, anything you want to add about powers or abilities before I move on?
Nope, I think you've covered it beautifully, Chris.
All right, thanks, bro. Now, this next part of the episode, and I mean this in a loving way, because I just love doing research like this. This was a bear to get through. This is Atlantis, and again, if we're talking like a character who's so deeply rooted to a particular part of the Marvel Universe, like again, T'Challa with Wakanda, Doom with Latveria. If you're going to talk about Namor the Submariner, you have to talk about Atlantis. Now, don't think of the Atlantis of Aquaman. That's a whole different universe, essentially. And this is the Atlantis of the Marvel Universe. And over the decades, various writers have added their 2 cents to sort of the mythology and the history of this civilization. Now, as we know, in our own real world, we have the long-standing myth of Atlantis, which some explorers believe was a continent thousands of years ago and an advanced civilization that there was some cataclysm that sank beneath the ocean. I think back to Ghostbusters. Do you believe in the theory of Atlantis? When Ernie Hudson's getting his job interview, but there is a whole body of myth around this notion of this world called Atlantis, which influences both, the Aquaman mythos and the Submariner mythos. Now, as you mentioned, when Everett first introduces the character and his world, he doesn't call it Atlantis, although clearly that was on his mind. It's not referred to as Atlantis until Submariner Comics issue 31. So quite a few years after the character's first appearance.
Right. It's like right before the character was put to bed for a few years at the end of the Golden Age.
Good point, Murd. So what we're talking about here is sort of the history of Marvel's version of Atlantis. Now, I'm jumping any time here, but this is just what I can. Again, I had to kind of compress a lot of material. So these are highlights based, because some of these entries are whole other. Like when you talk about like Cole the Conqueror, that's a whole other area.
Right.
Basically.
That's barely the Marvel Universe,
Yeah.
really. Just kind of a convenient way
That's
to tie.
Robert Howard folded into the Marvel Universe,
Right.
basically.
To tie all that into the Marvel Universe proper.
So, in Marvel's timeline, the continent, the surface civilization is founded in circa 19,000 BCE. And for example, Kull, who ruled the kingdom of Valusia, he apparently hailed from this continent. Now, Kull, of course, is the Robert E. Howard, Pulps, Conan, that whole... And actually, Conan's going to come into this just a moment, actually, as well. Now, the Marvel Atlantis that was on the surface was an empire of sailors and merchants, traders, explorers, very sophisticated for its time period. They discovered the Savage Land, for example. Atlantean alchemists created what we know as the Serpent Crown of Set. Murd, what's the significance? I have my notes. Murd, please begin. The Serpent Crown of Set. Right. This is your meat, my friend.
The short answer, dear
Yes.
readers, is read Marvel Team Up Annual number 5 by written and drawn by the great Mark Gruenwald.
Yes.
Because, talk about writ connoisseurs.
Yes.
I mean, Roy Thomas kind of invented that, but Mark Gruenwald made some pretty fantastic strides in that area himself. Where he takes, in that story, which is a team-up between Spider-Man and Doctor Strange and Iron Man and Quasar is in it. There's a whole bunch of different people. And there's time in there for Doctor Strange to do a mystically empowered recap of the whole twisted serpentine history of the Serpent Crown as a power object in the Marvel Universe and the corruptive influence it's had for thousands and thousands of fictional years. But it was created by a group of alchemists in the service of the ancient elder god Set, who was sort of serpentine in aspect. And those who worshipped him were, his earliest worshippers were a race of proto-human reptilian beings known as the Serpent Men, whom Conan the Barbarian eventually fought and defeated. So some of a group of their alchemists created this power object called the Serpent Crown as a means for Set to expand his influence on Earth, and for they themselves to access a part of his nigh infinite godly might to wield in his name on Earth. The first known human wearer of the Serpent Crown was one of those alchemists, a man named Atra. And it was passed down through various bearers over the years. For a time, a leader of the Lemurian offshoot of Homo Mermanus, named Naga, who had an unusually long lifespan as a result of his interaction with the crown, was its bearer. And as a result of his interaction with the crown and all of Lemuria falling into step with him, that's one reason why the Lemurian Homo Mermani are green and scaly-skinned as opposed to the usual blue. It is because of the corruptive influence of Set through the Serpent Crown. The crown was stolen away. This is starting to sound like the prehistory of the One Ring from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings epic, which is no accident either, Indeed. I'm sure. It was stolen away by a valiant rebel who went and founded yet another offshoot Atlantean Lemurian colony somewhere. He and his followers encased the Serpent Crown in gold alloy that supposedly prevented it from having such a strong influence on
it totally corrupts the wearer,
yes,
right?
Yes, it puts him totally under the influence of Set himself. But this gold alloy muted that influence somewhat, but didn't completely undo it, because it still corrupted its wearer to some extent, and as a result of that, that colony was destroyed. And there, that crown eventually was found by Paul Destin, a character we'll come back to, who referred to it as the Helmet of Power or the Helmet of the Ancients. And it sort of corrupted him, too, drove him a little bit crazy.
He was a psionic to begin with.
Right.
So.
It just unleashed his pre-existing latent psionic abilities. Right. But shortly after Paul Destin took possession of the crown and wreaked some havoc with it, and after his death, it came back into Atlantean hands, and then it finally shook off the gold alloy that had encased it for years, and the Serpent Crown's true nature became known again. And from there on, it just created all kinds of wickedness and suffering throughout the Marvel Universe. And it was a favorite plot device of Mr. Grunwald himself.
In the 80s, a lot, you would see the Serpent Crown in stories. I remember that quite fondly.
Throughout his tenure as writer of the Marvel 2-in-1 or team-up books.
Outstanding, brother. I was counting on that. Thank you very much.
Yep, it's probably more than the readers needed to know.
No.
And yet less than I could have said.
Not when it's through your mellifluous voice, Murd, please. Now, so the last monarchs of the surface version of Atlantis in the Marvel Universe were King Kamu and Queen Zartra. And apparently the Deviants attacked the capital city of the Atlantean Empire. Now, of course, the Deviants are an offshoot of the Eternals, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Who were not introduced until, the very end of the 70s. So
this
pretty much
all retconning.
Right. There's extensive retconning going on with the ancient societies of the Eternals and Deviants, and how they gave rise to the various other little subterranean and subaqueous secret societies throughout the Marvel Universe. Retconnoisseurs such as Grunwald and Roger Stern and Roy Thomas over the years have gone to great lengths to show how all of these things are interconnected. And so that's how we end up with the Deviants being indirectly involved with the evolution of Homo Mermanus and the various sea monsters that Homo Mermanus have been known to command.
So during that attack, Kamu, to save them, to destroy the Deviants, is forced to open like magma pits beneath the city that kind of provided with energy. And he has to open them up, and the lava spills forth. And while this is happening, the Deviants, and this is one of their less than intelligent moves, decide to attack the second host of the Celestials. Merge very quickly with the Celestials again.
Oh, yes, a race of, almost capital G godlike beings.
Yes.
So more so even than the Asgardians or Olympians. Yeah. They are they manifest as beings that are a couple 100 feet tall, and they travel throughout the known universe, doing little experiments with the evolution of the living races that they find here and there. Eventually, I think it's Jim Kruger and Alex Ross in their Earth X trilogy. They reveal that one possible explanation for this is that they create superhuman strains on these planets as a way of protecting celestial embryos that are concealed within those planets.
And the Celestials often, what people would fear is that they may return to judge.
As they often do.
A planet that they visited eons before.
Right. They come in waves or hosts separated by thousands, if not millions of years.
And, of course, the Celestials are a classic Kirby concept from his return to Marvel in the 70s.
Right. And they, too, were first introduced as part of that Eternals maxi-series at the tail end of the 70s.
And the current Jason Aaron's whole overarching Avengers saga right now deals heavily with the Celestials, and he's also retconning now. You haven't read these stories yet, right?
No, I haven't.
That I won't spoil, but he's also retconning now the Celestials' involvement in the very beginnings of the Marvel Earth, essentially. So I look forward to your reaction to those when you get to them.
Well, that also ties in with the Kruger-Ross thing about how Earth might have a celestial zygote or something concealed at its core.
Bird, when the time bubble reaches that particular port, I look forward to your reaction. All right, so the Deviants also attack the Second of Celestials, who are tied with nuclear energy, and those two events, they sink the continent of Atlantis, and they sink Lemuria, which is another civilization, I believe.
Right, there's like two different Lemurias, and one of them is like the home of the Deviants, or one of the homes of the Deviants, and the other one is the ultimate home of those green, scaly Homo Mermani.
Now, so here's where it gets complicated. So the continent sinks. Now, some of the people who survive, they go off, like, for example, according to Marvel history, the Sumerians, who are the people of Conan, they are descendants of some of the surviving Atlanteans from the surface continent, essentially. You have Netheria, Queen Kala, who sets up another underground version. Remember we talked about that Iron Man story where he goes back? That's like another version of the Atlanteans who were submerged, right?
Yep, yet another subterranean civilization.
But they're not Homo Mermanus. They live in like a bubble of some kind.
Right. So they're more like the human Atlanteans that inhabited the continent before it sank, and who were not converted into water breathers. And Queen Kala, of course, had interactions with the Mole Man and Tyrannus.
Right. All the various fun Marvel subterranean individuals and species. Now, so here's what's tough about this research. We mentioned this at the beginning of the episode. There have been many locations for Atlantis in Marvel's history. There hasn't just been one spot where there's always been this undersea kingdom of Atlantis. It's moved around based on cataclysm or war policy, what have you. So, circa 10,000 years ago, the Homo Romanus people appear. Now, as Bird mentioned, they may have been engineered by the Deviants or the Inhumans, for example. Terrigen, who knows? According to the creation myth, the Atlanteans themselves, Neptune, the god of the sea, spawned them, essentially.
And they have had interactions with that Olympian over the years as well, direct interactions.
Or it could be that they are evolved descendants of the surface people of Atlantis. We don't know, right? So, but originally they appear as like fish-like beings in the early Golden Age stories. We get to the Marvel Age, they are water-breathing humanoids who have blue skin, except for Namor, of course. Now, approximately 8,000 years ago, these undersea dwellers discovered the ruins of the capital of ancient Atlantis, the surface Atlantis, and they make that into their city. Another offshoot faction finds the sunken city of Lemuria. That's who you're talking about, who become the green reptilian-like beings. And they're the ones who get the serpent crown and that whole story. We'll talk later on about Lyra, who is from that version of Lemuria. Now, in the early 20th century, as Murd mentioned, the Emperor Thakur, he moves the city near Antarctica. And that's where the first stories of Namor occur in the Golden Age. Now, the Namor series from the 2000s, where he's a kid, where they revisit his youth. In the 20s and 30s, they set up a new Atlantis near the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and they actually are trading with humans. That's where Namor has interaction with the girl Sandy. It becomes like a first young love for him. And they have young Dorma, young Byra, all these different characters. And that city is abandoned due to an oil spill. Now, one of the recurring themes with the Atlanteans is how they're always being damaged or threatened by surface dwellers abusing their environment. That'll all of a sudden Namor into a rage, for example. Now, I couldn't find exactly where Atlantis ended up after this, but in World War II, as we know, Namor will fight. Well, he kind of fights everybody, but more often than not, he fights the Axis powers.
Yep, he figures out which humans are most deserving of his rage fairly quickly.
And in fact, there'll be numerous times where the Axis, especially the Nazis, will actually send undersea forces to actually attack Atlantis itself. Namor has to repulse them. We've all seen famous Golden Age covers of Namor attacking German U-boats. Namor taking on Imperial Japan. I remember there was one story I read about where the Japanese build a underground tunnel through the Bering Strait to get to Alaska. Namor stops them. Fun, wacky, zany Golden Age stuff. We'll get to the flooding of Manhattan a little bit later. So I'm not sure where Atlantis is at that point. Now, it's during this era where Namor also fights with the All Winners Squad. Now, was that a Golden Age team of timely icons of that time?
It was introduced pretty late in the Golden Age. They only had 2 adventures as an actual team.
Okay.
And the Nazis had been pretty safely vanquished by then.
Okay. And then, of course, Roy Thomas, the champion of retconning again. In the 70s, the classic Invaders series. That's a whole other discussion. That's the Invaders have their own great history. But that's when Namor fights alongside Bucky, Cap, Human Torch, Toro, Spitfire, right? Mm-hmm. Union Jack.
Yep.
And in fact, just a couple of years ago, I didn't read it. Marvel did a new Invaders story. I think James Robinson wrote it. Actually.
Yes, and Atlanteans were kind of in the thick of that, too.
Did you read it?
Bought it.
Okay. Time bubble yet again. Excellent. Okay, so in the 1950s, Atlantis seeks United Nations membership, but due to the bigotry of the surface world, they're rejected. And Thakor is still the Empress. Sorry, we're going to isolate ourselves from humans. Of course, when Namor is also in the publishing history is brought back by Lee. It's when he's fighting communists. And it's in the 50s that Paul Destin unearths the Serpent Crown in the Antarctic, which was buried by Lemurians, as Murd mentioned. And as Murd also mentioned, Destin, would you say Destin was a mutant?
Yes.
Okay, because he had psionic powers.
Yes, I think he actually has been classified as such by official Marvel resources.
Okay. And he puts on the crown. The crown, of course, corrupts him and it enhances his psionic ability. And because of the incredible sort of enhancement of his powers, it creates undersea earthquakes, and it destroys Atlantis, essentially. Thakor and Fen are seemingly killed. And this is where Namor in that cataclysm is rendered amnesiac, and now he's going to wander the surface world for decades. In Marvel time, it's decades now. So
it was only about 7 years originally.
So the Atlantean survivors of the cataclysm, now this often happens in the case of the Atlanteans, as Bird mentioned. They'll disperse, they'll find new colonies, they'll go off into other places. Now, is it Bira or Byra?
It can be whatever you want it to be, Chris. I've always said Bira, personally.
Bira is sorry, nod to your magnificent enunciation.
Let's call the whole thing off.
So Bira is a cousin of Namor, often is jealous and is a rival for the throne, essentially.
Yep. He was introduced, actually, back in the... I think he had made one appearance in the 40s, and then during the 50s revival, he was kind of a recurring minor nemesis for Namor.
And then they bring him into the Marvel Age as well. Mm-hmm. And Bira, he'll establish a new Atlantis in the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean with so many of the survivors of that cataclysm. Now, when we get into, let's call it the modern era, it's really the Silver Age forward. But because of the Marvel time slide, it's really not supposed to be that long ago, essentially. So in FF4, as we mentioned, Namor is revived. And he's now, and his early adventures are him trying to find his people, essentially. Eventually he does. He's made the Sovereign the King. And, of course, in this time period, he invades the surface world on more than one occasion due to some environmental clash or things like that. This is the time period where he forms periodic alliances with Dr. Doom. Often because it's to the interest of his people to do so. I couldn't find when this happened, Morgana Le Fay at one point brings the continent of Atlantis to the surface. Are you familiar with that?
Was that? I guess that wouldn't have been a part of Atlantis Attacks. Maybe it was the Atlantis Rising mini crossover.
Well, the title works.
Yeah, that's what made me think of that. But yeah, that was kind of a crappy little '90s mini crossover.
I remember the ridiculously enhanced cover for that one.
Oh yes, like the acetate overlays. Yeah. I think Morgan might have been involved in that. The name Maritanus.
You're correct, because when she does that, of course, it totally disrupts, the ecological balance of their world. So the survivors reestablished an Atlantean colony in Maritanus, as you mentioned.
Somewhere along the line, there was another colony Namor helped to found called Deluvia.
That one didn't come upon him, but again, that wouldn't surprise me because, again, this history is very dense.
Yeah, I think we're talking somewhere in the early 70s.
Yeah. So, a new Atlantis, fast-forwarding to more recent X-Men history, because Namor is a mutant. So, the X-Men create their utopia, that island they lived on, which is like its own country, essentially. Mm-hmm. And they asked Namor to establish a new Atlantis beneath it, as sort of like a support pillar for utopia, which Namor agrees to do. And during the Avengers versus X-Men epic, both Utopia and New Atlantis are destroyed in that confrontation. And then sometime, and again, this is just the highlights here, ladies and gentlemen. This history is very dense. And sometimes after that, the Squadron Supreme, again, characters from various realities, right? They see Namor as an ongoing threat, plus the incursions of all just occur, which we'll talk about. And they kill Namor.
Chop his head right off.
Chop his head off. And Hyperion, who's like, I think Roy Thomas invented him to be like Superman.
Exactly. He was, because the whole Squadron Supreme is supposed to be Justice League
analogs.
analogs.
Silver Age. He lifts up the Atlantis and casts it onto land, essentially. And then eventually Namor is resurrected, and then the city is rebuilt. And I'm not sure where it is exactly, but there is, in the Marvel now, there currently is an Atlantis. And again, if you read the Avengers issues right now, they're getting into that. So that's my really quick, breathless history of Atlantis in the Marvel Universe. Anything you want to add to that? Or
I dare not, Chris. For one thing, you've shown a superior command of the history to my own. I mean, this is one part of Marvel history that's always kind of made my head spin. And for another, we got to keep moving.
Indeed. But again, if you're interested, ladies and gentlemen, just go on Marvel Wiki or go into the official handbook. It's a rich... It's amazing, as you mentioned, Mert, how some of these writers, they'll do such wonderful work in trying to tie everything together and flesh it all out. And Atlantis is a great example of that.
You don't go to the first volume of the Marvel Handbook if you want to know about Atlantis, because that was covered in the early going when they were still showing a lot more restraint as far as textual density. Yeah. Later editions will give you a lot more information for your buck.
Okay, so quick little... just blurbs about key members of Namor's supporting cast. So we mentioned Thakor, the Emperor, again, who was only referred to as the Holy One originally. He first appears in Motion Picture Funnies Weekly #1, but as Merv mentioned, he's not referred to as Thakor until Submariner #1 in 1968. He will die as a vampire in Namor the First Mutant #1.
Wow.
So you think he's dead when Paul Destin does his wackiness. He's resurrected. Apparently, there's like an aquatic vampire race. They're called the Aqueous or something like that, who the Atlanteans had sort of like an uneasy detente with, and Thakor becomes one of them. So he perishes apparently for good in Namor the First Mutant #1. Namor's mother, Fen, also first appears in Motion Picture Funnies Weekly #1. She dies in the Byrne series. She comes back in Namor the Submariner #40. So they bring her back as well.
Only to kill her again.
Yes. Leonard Mackenzie. Now, we think he's killed in Motion Picture Funnies Weekly #1 / Marvel Comics #1. They actually bring him back in Namor's first ongoing Marvel series, eponymous series, The Submariner, in issue 46. He's actually killed by Tiger Shark, one of Namor's sort of periodic nemesis. And before he dies, he and Namor have they come together, and Namor realizes that that's his human father, and they have a moment, and then he perishes. But so he dies back in the 70s. They kill him off in Submariner #46. All right, Dorma. As you mentioned, Mert, she first appears not in the Motion Picture Funnies Weekly, but Marvel Comics #1, those fleshed-out pages. Namor's cousin. And in the early Silver Age stories, where they use her quite a bit, she's often, again, classic Stan Lee, early female characters, very jealous, whiny, not exactly like the modern, strong female character you'll be more familiar with in later eras of American comics. And eventually, though, Namor does fall in love with her and vice versa. And she's killed off in Submariner 37.
Yep, just... right after they'd consummated their... Well, not consummated, but performed their wedding vows.
And the thing was that Lyra of Lemuria, who was a rival for Namor, she was masquerading as Dorma. So Namor thought he was marrying Dorma was actually marrying Lyra, and she had captured Dorma, and she has her on the surface in like some kind of water-breathing chamber. Because Atlanteans, except for Namor, cannot live above water for very long, outside of water. And Namor tries to rescue her, and she suffocates, and she dies in his arms. So they never brought her back. She's been dead, as far as I know, ever since. So, Namora, who is Namor's cousin, she first appears in Marvel Mystery Comics number 82. And as far as I know, she's been around ever since.
Well, she, too, had a stint where she was dead for a time. She said she was introduced back there in the 40s. I've got it here somewhere in my notes, the exact date. May of 1947. Introduced by artist Kenneth Bald, with inks by Sid Shores. And so she was Namor's cousin, so described. He had a few of those, apparently.
Yes, he did.
And she was kind of his golden-haired partner in crime fighting for a time there, because in the late 40s, Marvel kind of got away from the whole kid sidekick trend. And,
yes.
Every single one of the kid sidekicks they replaced were replaced with fully grown female crime fighting partners. Captain America...
That's right.
Stan Lee, who had risen to an editorial role by this time, probably had something to do with all of this.
Teenage sidekicks.
Right, so instead, Cap got the female partner, Golden Girl, Human
and
Torch.
Bucky was shot.
Yeah.
Kind of cast aside.
Took the rest of the Golden Age to recuperate, apparently. And the Human Torch teamed up with Sun Girl and Namor, who never really went in for kid sidekicks because he was kind of an angry youth in and of himself. Yes. He ended up with his cousin Namora, who was, after her introduction, was almost instantly leveraged across all Namor stories in all the mags in which he was appearing. And he did appear in a number of them, if we haven't mentioned already. In addition to Marvel Mystery Comics and his own title, he was also in All Winners and All Select Comics. And he was also a regular in the back pages of the Human Torch's solo series for most of its run.
And more on that in a moment.
Yep. So, Namora was by his side for most of the remaining Golden Age, and she popped up a couple of times in the 1950s revival as well.
And she's still around today.
Yep. Although, as I said, she did die for a time,
only for a time, Murd. Only for a time.
Yeah, I think she's present when Namor pops the question to Dorma, I think.
Okay.
Or at least she's seen in flashback.
And coming out of that is Namorita, who was actually created by Bill Everett when he returned to Submariner in the 70s. Shortly before his death, he worked on a series of issues that he wrote, drew, inked, or some combination of other people were helping depending on his health. But she first appears in Submariner number 50, and she's an Everett creation. Now, of course, some listeners may remember her from Civil War. Now she later becomes a blue-skinned Atlantean. She sort of mutates for some reason. I don't know why.
That actually happened before that, I think.
It did.
So maybe she's flip-flopped between the blue and Caucasian states. But when in the New Warriors in the mid-'90s, her blue-skinned Atlantean heritage came out.
Correct.
And she became known as Chimera, which is the name
right.
of a genus of deep-sea dwelling shark for a time.
And she will die in, of course, that infamous explosion that Nitro causes when the New Warriors are fighting him in Stamford, Connecticut,
lest we forget.
Yes, and that, of course, will embroil Namor, and that's still one of my favorite Marvel crossover events of recent years. We mentioned Bira, who first appears, as you mentioned, Murd, in Submariner. I might be wrong. I meant Submariner 35. You said, though, he was a Golden Age character.
I think he did make one random appearance somewhere along the line. I have here Marvel Mystery Comics number 82.
I'm going to go with that then. And again, he is a cousin. He's not always portrayed as completely antithetical in that he will sometimes, or antipathetic, I should say. Sometimes he will side with Namor for the good of Atlantis, for example.
Which is also his own good, after
Yeah,
all.
kind of think about it like almost like an Ocean Master type character who will. He's not completely irredeemable. Now, someone who is irredeemable is Krang, the warlord of Atlantis. He first appears in FF Annual number 1, and he's constantly vying for the throne. He's like one of those classic usurper type characters. Also wants Dorma, and he's often a thorn in Namor's side. My favorite, of course, Namor adversary is Atuma, he of the bunny ears. Now, he's an Atlantean. He's Homo Romanus, but he's part of a tribe that was exiled from Atlantis some time ago.
Right. A bunch of nomad barbarians who
And he
scorn civilization
yes,
and
and
prefer to...
he emerges as their warlord.
Yes, he's kind of a Goliath figure.
Yes.
Because he's a Philistine under the sea, and he's also much larger than the average Atlantean and much stronger.
So he can actually take on Namor to some degree. I mean, Namor always defeats him ultimately, but
yeah.
Great Kirby visual, like that funky helm with like the rabbit ears projecting out of it.
Was that an Everett K. Ross quotation you just used there? He of the bunny ears?
You know what? I didn't, not consciously, but it wouldn't surprise me if I'm channeling Ross. That's just, kudos to Christopher Priest there. Vashti is the vizier, the counselor to Namor. He first appears in Tales to Astonish 71. Sometimes he's ruled in Namor's stead when Namor's off adventuring or raging or what have you. You always see panels of Vashti like, my king, my lord, please, trying to like calm him down, and Namor's raging, and he's, the bearded. He's like Volko to Aquaman,
exactly.
Maybe not quite as Machiavellian, but similar type character. We mentioned Lyra of the Lemurians, the green scaly Lemurians. She first appears in Submariner 32, the Silver Age series. She's responsible for the death of Dorma, among other things.
She's kind of an anti-Namor figure in that she, too, is a half-breed. Yeah, she's the daughter of a Lemurian father and a surface-dwelling mother named Rhonda Morris. And she somehow developed the chameleon-like ability to actually change her appearance from green, scaly Lemurian to surface human.
Well, she masquerades as Dorma in that wedding ceremony, for example, and tricks Namor into, well, not that the marriage is legitimate, but into marrying her. Essentially.
And she actually has kind of a split personality, too, because part of her is sympathetic to her mother's surface world, and she can actually become a surface-dwelling human named Laura Morris. And it's kind of a Jekyll and Hyde situation.
Fantastic.
In the early going there.
Another classic Namor adversary from the Marvel era is Tiger Shark. First appearance of Submariner number 5. Now, he was an Olympic swimmer, if I remember correctly.
You do, yes.
Who had a spinal injury.
Yep, it's a little bit like Doctor Strange's origin, actually. He was kind of arrogant, except unlike Doctor Strange, he never got over it. And he sought help from the wrong corners. Instead of going to the Ancient One, I think he went to Dr. Dorcas, who...
Sure.
the mad marine biologist and would-be world conqueror Dr. Lemuel Dorcas, who... put him through the mutagenic
treatments. Encyclopedia just with arms and legs. It's amazing. Go ahead.
Just spliced his genetic material with that of Namor and also that of a tiger shark, so that he became this humanoid shark
Those fang
creature.
teeth.
Right, and the webbed digits and the enhanced musculature. And he became kind of savage in aspect.
Oh, he's a vicious
killer.
character.
Yep. His real name was Todd Arliss, and his sister, Diane Arliss, who also made her
an
first
ally
appearance.
of Namor, right?
And sometime love interest. He eventually married one of the other, actually the next character on your list of supporting characters. But she was a journalist, kind of I guess like a Lois Lane. And she was on hand for the mutation of her brother, and just kind of enhanced the tragedy of what became of him, how he made his rapid slide.
And Tiger Shark is actually... a featured character in the current Avengers storyline.
Is it really?
That when the time bubble docks in that era, you'll understand what I'm talking about.
He's been a master of evil at times.
Yes, he has. And now Stingray, Walter Newell, he's an oceanographer, isn't he?
Yes, a two-fisted oceanographer.
Yeah. He should be part of the Challengers of the Unknown. He first appears just as Walter in Tales to Astonish 95, so he's been around for a while. And then he gets the Stingray... it's called armor or suit.
Sure, armor works.
Yeah, in Submariner number 19, that first eponymous series from the Silver Age. And you want to talk a little about Stingray, just what his place is? Or
Well, we've kind of covered it. He's an oceanographer who first meets Namor in his civilian identity as Walter Newell and becomes an ally of his. And eventually he gains an ocean-going enhanced suit of armor in Submariner number 19, which I happen to own. It was drawn by Marie Severin. The color scheme on the cover is the familiar red and white we know nowadays, but I think inside it's actually like an orange and yellow. Kind of garish and ugly. So he's been kind of an explorer and adventurer more than a crime fighter for much of his career.
And he was involved in the Avengers Hydra base period, wasn't he?
Yes.
The keeper of that,
Yes, I think he was one of those who brokered the Avengers taking possession of the Hydra base.
And again, without spoiling, he also plays a role in the current Avengers storyline. So, okay, now, anything else you want to say about any of these supporting characters?
I don't think so.
Not a complete list. It's just some of the most prominent people that are recurring. And I'm going to mention some, like I haven't mentioned Betty Dean yet. She'll come up in a little bit. But now I want to talk a little bit about Namor's origin. Now, some of this we've kind of covered. Some stuff I'm going to skip over just so we're not repeating myself endlessly. But so as Murd mentioned, based on the chronology, as far as we can tell, Namor was born in 1920. Now, in 1915, there was a British expedition seeking vibranium in Antarctica.
Definite retcon there.
Yes, which is lost. And then Leonard Mackenzie with Paul Destin, also retconned,
right,
launched a second expedition, and their ice-breaking explosions damaged Atlantis, and this is where Fenn is sent in that whole thing we talked about earlier in the episode where she meets Leonard and they mate and so forth. Now, as the first issue of Marvel Comics indicates, Namor is raised with a profound distrust, if not hatred, of surface dwellers. I mean, his mother encourages him to make war on them, for example. Retcon, he's raised with his cousins Dorma, Namora, and Bera. As we mentioned, during World War II, Namor begins, shall we say, a very tumultuous relationship with the democratic societies. He primarily fights the Axis. Murd mentioned the All-Winter Squad. Roy Thomas has the classic retcon Invaders stories where he meets Captain America, for example. But he will also battle the Allies sometimes as well. Now, I have to go to Human Torch number 5. So in this story, Namor feels that he is best destined to rule the entire Earth rather than the warring powers. He's going to end it all and bring order to everything. And there's a great panel where he fancies himself like Napoleon, and he's trying on this new uniform, and I'm quoting here from the issue. "My victory uniform," he's preening in the mirror. "If Goering ever saw it, he turned green with envy." Just comparing himself to the often flamboyant costumes of the Nazi head of the German Luftwaffe. So, but during that attack, he has mechanized whale ships that can generate these incredible tidal waves. He wipes out all the Axis armies. He attacks the Soviet Red Army. Then he decides to, and the Human Torch is trying to stop him, and then he tries to attack Manhattan. So here is the description from that issue. Now, if you're a fan of Marvels, you've seen the gorgeous Alex Ross artwork capturing this moment when they're fighting. They say New Yorkers have seen everything, but here's something they never saw. A mammoth tidal wave, so high it surmounts the city's tallest building, so wide it stretches from the Battery to the Bronx, so terrific it slams down the world's most famous skyline as if it were built with cards, and then its fury, still unspent, spans the Hudson River and roars westward. Goodbye, Broadway, so long Times Square. Down goes the Empire State Building. Down goes the George Washington Bridge. But the spirit of the populace stays up. Forewarned by the president to prepare for such an emergency, they respond to water raid sirens, don diving helmets, and enter watertight shelters below the flooded subways.
So, despite New York being obliterated, very few people actually were killed, apparently. Covering themselves there. Yeah, that issue of Human Torch number 5, is kind of it's sort of a legend,
absolutely, of
the Golden Age here. Not just for the story content, but for the conditions of its production. Because by Everett's own account, it was knocked out by a mob of creators, like 4 or 5 writers and 6 or so artists who just locked themselves in an apartment and didn't emerge except to go on food and booze runs.
This was a 60-page issue. I'm going to read a quote from it just to support what Murphy was just saying. This is Everett's own words. Let's see. I'm reading, this is Blake Bell's description. In the fall of 1941, issue number 5 featured the second collaboration between Burgos and Everett, an epic 60-page battle between their two creations. How the issue was put together at Everett's apartment on 33rd Street over 1 weekend has acquired legendary status in the history books as the most quickly produced comic ever. Here's Everett's words: We did turn it out something like between Wednesday or Thursday and the following Monday. We stayed there the entire weekend. Nobody left except to go out to get food or liquor and come back and work. We had 4 or 5 writers, and we had at least 6 artists, including Carl and myself. So, if you ever read, have you read Adventures of Cavalier and Clay?
Actually, I was going to bring that up. I have read it just this past. Well, I don't have that much to say, but I read it just this past spring, and this weekend does definitely call to mind the scenes Chabon was describing of Sammy Clay and Joe Cavalier and their young artist friends just locking themselves in and putting together the first issue of Amazing Midget Radio Comics.
Yep, and that's totally inspired by this actual incident because, again, Chabon is a huge student of comic book history, and he brought that into his. I hope you enjoyed the novel.
Oh, I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's. I felt like it kind of lost its direction, maybe halfway through. But the early parts, just describing, the vim and vigor and the raw energy,
yes,
and the hunger and hope of these young men in New York City trying to make a name for themselves in the funny books. It hit home for me as a fan, and it was just a fun read. Besides,
I figured you would enjoy it. Well, another time we can talk about that in more detail. I'd love to get more of your thoughts on it. So I lost my page here. Oh, here we go. So that's Human Torch number 5. Now, also, Namor had a childhood friend named Morano. He becomes the Axis agent U-Man, who I think is from the Invaders stories, correct?
Yes, first appearance Invaders number 3, 1975.
So again, the Axis powers did try to actually destroy Atlantis, because Namor was siding... When Namor was taking sides, it was more often with the Allies, so Hitler saw Namor as a threat. Now, as you mentioned, the 50s... Namor and Cap and Torch are revived briefly to fight communists in Young Men issue 24. This is where they kind of take away the edge of the character. He's not, flooding cities and shaking his fist at humanity. He's now more fighting communists and smugglers and things of that nature. And Namora, she's often with him and so forth. So the character loses some of that so-called anti-hero edge. Now, of course, we get to the Silver Age, which we mentioned FF4. Again, not to be repetitive, Namor is restored by the Human Torch. We mentioned, of course, he's the key player and, of course, reviving Captain America inadvertently in Avengers issue 4. As Mert mentioned briefly, he also fights the X-Men. He briefly sides with Magneto during the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants and all that. But again, one of the things about Namor's character that they stick to consistently is he's not really a team player. He never stays for long in any kind of organization. And he says he decides not to work with Magneto, and he fights the X-Men, then he goes off on his own again, essentially. They established the retro continuity that he also has a conflict with the Hellfire Club and Sebastian Shaw, and that establishes a history he has with Emma Frost. They become sort of allies. As Bird mentioned, he's a founding member, although not necessarily on purpose, for the Defenders. And then he serves the Avengers on several occasions. Go ahead, Bird, what were you saying?
No, just that he didn't stick around the Defenders all that long either.
Not at all. In fact, the prototype of the Defenders is in the Submariner comic, and then when they go over to Marvel Feature number 1 in the early Bronze Age, when you have the first formal appearance of those characters.
That's right. There was a quick little digressive, 2-issue story where he teams up with the Hulk and the Silver Surfer.
I'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah, just before he got married or tried to get married to Dorma.
And as you mentioned, Dorma is suffocated by Lyra of Lemuria in this time period. Later on, he'll marry Marina of Alpha Flight. Do you remember that character?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And she could lose her mind and
well, yeah, she's kind of a tragic figure, too. I mean, the backstory there was that she's the product of an alien probe. From an alien race called the Clonics.
A Byrne character, right?
Yes, absolutely, of the Alpha Flight team. And she was her genetic matrix was supposed to just kind of crash on a planet to be colonized and just interact with its environment and with the genetic material of things around it and mutate, multiply, and conquer. But her pod was damaged or something, and so when her little egg came down to Earth. Instead of mutating into a killing and conquering machine, she was found by a human couple who kept a lighthouse. So similar to the Aquaman origin.
And they raised her in a benevolent fashion.
She just kind of bonded with them genetically and became more or less humanoid, although also aquatic. But her true nature was always meant to be something more monstrous.
Yeah.
And at a couple of times...
When her face kind of transformed like a fanged visage.
Yes,
right?
become more like a sea monster.
Yeah.
And when she finally reached her final mutation, she became a gigantic sea serpent called Leviathan. And this was in a story that Walt Simonson did in the Avengers.
But Namor fell in love with her, though, and
they married, yeah. There was an actual wedding ceremony.
Yeah.
It happened in the Alpha Flight series.
But then she perished. So
she ate some bad fish and became this giant sea serpent, and Namor had to kill her. So
Namor hasn't had much luck when it comes to
he's had
romance.
many paramours, and none of them ever work out.
We
for
should
him
also
long-term.
mention, by the way, another one of Namor's sort of powers. He's basically irresistible to women.
Huh.
And, of course, the Sue Storm, that's one of the classic motifs in the Fantastic Four's history.
Yep, writers will not leave that triangle alone,
Is
even
that
after all these years.
Susan Storm / Richards finds him irresistible. And he is drawn to her. And, of course, from the early days of their first appearance in the Silver Age, there was always that tension where Namor is drawn to Sue, Sue is drawn to him, at least in terms of like a sexual attraction. And, of course, Reed is, trying to compete against this Adonis, essentially. And, they return to it again and again and again. Now, of course, underneath that, there's always this respect that clearly is there between these two characters. But he's long been drawn to Susan and has coveted her on more than one occasion. So, I remember there's a classic... Did you ever read FF1234 by Grant Morrison?
Yeah, I covered that on the Time Bubble.
Okay.
Yes, I was thinking about that, how Namor was the trap that Dr. Doom had. The whole point of the series was that he created these customized ultimate death traps for all 4 members of the FF, and Namor was his idea of a trap for Sue.
And, he comes to her apartment, she opens the door, he's standing there just in his briefs, resplendent, water dripping, and she just looks at him and goes, "I'm married!"
Yes, and it's Doom's misreading of the Fantastic, and Sue in particular.
Yes.
That was the missing domino in his scheme.
Well, she's the strength of the whole team.
Yep,
Basically.
and Doom underestimated her badly, and that was his undoing.
So, we mentioned Atlantis Attacks. Not a very memorable crossover, but he fights off Atuma yet again, and that's when he's lost and presumed dead, and that's when he's found by the Alexanders in the South Pacific. This is the Byrne run, the great Namor the Submariner series. And
that crossover does strengthen the links between the Deviants and the Atlanteans, incidentally.
Want to expand on that a little bit?
Well, yeah, the big bad of the Atlantis Attacks crossover was Gar, who was like the
Lord of the Deviants.
Right, the priest king of the Deviant race. And he was trying to summon some kind of... he had amassed 7 characters, including Sue Storm, to be the brides of Gar, who were going to help in, I think, bringing Set through.
For the Serpent Crown again.
Yes, I think that's what was going on. I haven't actually read Atlantis Attacks, although there is somewhere nearby a collected edition.
One of the ones Matt had
to which, in fact, I'm tapping the spine right now, to which we could refer.
Yep.
But it's awfully fat, and we're not going to read it while we're on the air.
I read it when it came out. When was that? Say 1989. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's been 30 years since I read that.
So, as you've said, right before the beginning of the John Byrne.
Yep.
And concurrent with the Saga of the Submariner maxi series.
Right out of that. So when he's found by the Alexanders, they make him aware of that imbalance in his brain from too much air or too much water, which again I think is a brilliant retro continuity moment by Byrne. And this is where Namor establishes his corporation, Oracle Incorporated. And I love this idea. He funds it because he knows where all the sunken treasure is in all the oceans. Spanish galleons and so forth. So the purpose of Oracle is to preserve the oceans and its people. And in this series, I'm just a couple quick highlights. This is where Fen returns, but she then dies. This is after Iron Fist has seemingly been killed at the end of Power Man Iron Fist, the series, which actually Christopher Priest wrote to James Owsley. And Namor is instrumental in discovering that Danny Rand is still alive. There's stories of Kunlun in this series. Namor will also rip off the head of Master Khan, who's like one of the key nemesis of Power Man and Iron Fist. He also, and Murd, you'll appreciate this, he bankrolls the Oracle, the Heroes for Hire team, that series you loved.
I do remember Namor being present in that
Yep.
Oracle Inc. Actually, I think Namor may have abdicated as CEO of that, but I think he did a lot of abdication over the years. He might actually have left Danny Rand in charge of the corporation.
Very
for a
likely.
time.
And he made a good point that Namor will leave his throne on numerous occasions for adventure or quest or what have you, and that will often lead to tension between him and his people.
Do you know where he came up with the name Oracle Inc., incidentally?
Please enlighten me, brother.
It was the name of his father, Leonard Mackenzie's exploratory vessel. It's mentioned right there in his very first appearance back in 1939.
Deep cut, Murd.
I had not known that until I read the reprint I have here in Invaders number 20.
Outstanding. All right, Namor is also a member of the Illuminati, which, of course, is a more... Now, the Illuminati have always been around in terms of retro continuity. Some of the heavy hitters of the Marvel Universe will band together to try to sort of move events in a direction that is most to their advantage of them and their world. So it's Black Bolt, T'Challa, Namor, Professor Xavier, Tony Stark, and Stephen Strange, if I remember correctly. So we had various great stories with that. We mentioned how he'll side with Captain America, one of the few surface dwellers he truly respects during Civil War. Of course, remember, Namorita dies due to Nitro's explosion. During these stories, it's also revealed he has a long-lost son named Kamar who attempts to usurp his throne. And Namor puts Nitro down there, and Nitro overloads and explodes, destroying Atlantis, and Kamar is killed. And at this point, this is when Doom will turn up again. Doom and Namor have like this periodic alliance where their interests will coincide and they'll work together as fellow monarchs, essentially. This is where Doom will sort of give shelter and aid to Namor and his people. Namor will also join the Cabal at this point, which is sort of the antithesis of the Illuminati. It's Emma Frost, Doom, Norman Osborn, one of his lucid periods, Loki, and the Hood.
It is telling to Namor's character that he seems to fit in just as well on both
Perfectly
groups.
put. There's a great moment in one of the, it's a Cabal, I think it's a one-shot, maybe it's during the Dark Reign story, where Osborn he's kind of like helming the group, and then he leaves the room, and Doom looks at Namor and he goes, I'm paraphrasing, basically says to Namor, okay, he's going to lose his mind again. He says, when he does, I have the land, you have the sea. It's a great moment between those two characters and just the power dynamic between them. I think that's a Bendis Malev story, if I remember correctly. I remember Malev draws Namor, though. He does not draw him as a handsome being, though. He kind of draws him in an ugly way. It's very interesting. Mm-hmm. As we know, Namor also has an alliance with Emma Frost and the Dark X-Men. And, of course, during the A versus X story, he becomes one of the hosts of the Phoenix. Remember, the Phoenix takes 5 hosts during that story. And during those events, he actually floods Wakanda, causing tremendous destruction to the kingdom. And Shuri is, at this point, is the monarch, not T'Challa of the Wakandans. And she retaliates, leads an attack on Atlantis. Namor then joins Thanos' Black Order. We saw many of those people in the Avengers Infinity War film. Beautifully recreated, I thought, in the movie, by the way, the Black Order. And to strike back at Wakanda, Shuri will then be killed in that escalating conflict. And then we have... This is a lot of stuff happening very quickly here. This is all stuff in recent Marvel history. During the Incursion Crisis, Murd, have you read those stories?
No, I have not.
Okay, so do you know the premise behind them?
Well, I remember what the Incursion was about. It was a bunch of alternate or parallel universes threatening to coexist at the same point in time.
So the Illuminati is trying to save, the prime Earth of the Marvel Universe, essentially. And they're traveling to some of these alternate Earths, and they're very hesitant to basically destroy these other Earths, because basically what happens is the Incursion Crisis, they begin to realize the only way to save their Earth is to allow other Earths to be destroyed. And there's a key moment where they're on Earth 4290001, which has benevolent analogs of some of their characters on it. And T'Challa and Reed cannot bring themselves to destroy this Earth. And Namor says, I'll do it. He pushes the button on the device that Reed has created or whatever it is, and he wipes out this other Earth to save their Earth. To me, that is I can't believe I just forgot the name of the writer. Who's the great writer who did all the great FF stories?
Oh, good grief! Why am I can't believe
He did all the Incursion stories. He did New Avengers stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, we're failing miserably here.
Oh, this is unbelievable.
Yeah.
I talk about this guy fairly often. I'm not his biggest fan. He also wrote the Infinity
Yes, he did.
miniseries. Why can't
We'll drum up his name in a moment.
that
But
we both simultaneously
Yeah, well,
blank on his name?
Murd, you're going to be 40 soon, and I'm almost 46, so
Still too young for senior moments, Chris.
we'll come back to that. Some people now are screaming into their various.
He's been absent
devices.
from comics for a little
He
while
has been.
now.
Yeah. So during these stories are important because they really capture, I think, the essence of Namor, in that Namor is not this black and white do-gooder. Namor is that shade of gray character. Namor is the monarch. Namor is the person who's got to think about, my people and the burdens that obviously entails. So he wipes out this earth. Murda's looking at the name of that crazy.
Jonathan Hickman.
Thank you.
There it is.
Jonathan Hickman.
I don't know why somehow I thought the name had an L in it somewhere, and that's absolutely not correct. So we apologize to those of you whom we may have caused some distress and some hoarseness.
Now, after the events of the Incursion, we end up with the final Incursion, which ends with the Secret War story, where the last two remaining Earths are the Prime Marvel Universe and the Ultimate Marvel Universe, and they're going to collide. And the Black Panther and Namor kind of bury the hatchet. They join together to fight the Emperor God Doom, who rules the last fragment that came out of those two Earths, essentially, that he was able to maintain. And they help defeat him. And as we mentioned, the Squadron Supreme, who are beings from alternate realities, right? Murd, various other...
That Squadron Supreme
Yeah.
was, yeah.
Yeah.
There have been... I guess they're not the original Squadron
No,
Supreme.
no, they're not.
They were kind of a composite of Squadron Supreme-like characters from various now-defunct alternate Earths, including the original Squadron Supreme.
Who were all, like Hyperion's a member. And, of course, they blame Namor for his role in the incursions and the destruction that ensued, and they see him as an ongoing threat. So, as you said, they tear his head off. They kill him temporarily.
It got better.
Yes. And, again, this is a very quick overview of Namor's history. Again, please pursue further reading. But he is revived by Dr. Spectrum and Hyperion. He regains the throne. And as I mentioned now, and without spoiling from her, right now in the current Jason Aaron Avengers stories, which are wonderful, he is currently at odds with the Avengers over his dominion of the seas and what he sees as a threat to his underwater realm. So if you want to get current Namor and a more menacing Namor, more of that, unpredictable Namor, definitely check out current issues of the Avengers. Anything you wanted to mention there, Murr? About to speak.
Nope. I'm preparing to do some speaking eventually.
Great.
But, not at this precise time.
So some other sort of like quick checklist highlights I wanted to mention.
All right, I'm ready to jump in at this point.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Not at this point, but at this point, I have prepared myself to jump in at later points as we run down this checklist
Splendid.
you have prepared.
So Marvel Mystery Comics number 2. I mentioned this here because Namor drowns and murders a New York City police officer. So right off the bat, second issue, because as Murd mentioned, like those undersea salvage divers. Okay, he didn't know they were actually human. He knows in issue number 2. So he's at war with the surface world. Mm-hmm. And again, full circle in Avengers right now. And basically, again, he's going to war with the surface world. So
the title of that story is Attack on New York City.
Yes.
No room for ambiguity there.
And Marvel Mystery Comics number 3, very important supporting character, Betty Dean, who was a police officer. They would have called her a policewoman back then. And she kind of becomes sort of a on-again, off-again love interest for Namor. She tries to kind of control some of his passions, kind of steer him in the right direction, essentially. And she'll actually come back, as we mentioned, in the Marvel Age. Marvel Mystery Comics number 6, as I mentioned, Namor is given the electric chair for his crimes.
Let me slow roll for a second.
Please.
Here. I wanted to throw in an additional detail that Betty Dean was the ringleader of a group called the Legion of Loyalists. Which are basically a network of civilian anti-fascist subversion agents. This is before the United States was officially involved
Right.
in World War II, of course. But these are some citizens who are kind of chomping at the bit to nip fascism in the bud, and particularly get those dirty Buntists that were here in the United States even at that time.
We have to remember that excellent point, Murd, that there was a great debate in our country, 1939, 1940, 1941, whether or not the United States should actively be involved in the fighting. And there are many Americans, Charles Lindbergh is the most prominent example, who felt, you know what, this is Europe's problem. This goes back to World War I. We're sitting this one out. Let them handle it. And you had some of our people, especially Franklin Roosevelt, although he couldn't necessarily come out and say it so bluntly, who felt we had to get involved in this conflict, that Hitler was too much of a threat to world stability, essentially. And you saw that in some of the comics, like you just mentioned, or even Captain America comics #1, which was prior to Pearl Harbor, where certain people in our country are saying, look, we need to get involved in this war. And I'm not here to debate that right now. That's a totally different type of topic. But that's what was going on in our country. And you mentioned the Bundists. They had a huge rally at Madison Square Garden, for example. They were a American Nazi organization that was fairly vocal and active in the lead up to our involvement in World War II. Nicely done, Bert.
Yeah, one of the advantages of Namor not being American was that he could be shown fighting these guys on his own initiative.
Which they did many times. You think of those U-boat attacks, the covers, things like that.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Issue #4, in fact, the very next one after he first meets Betty Dean, is the first time he's shown fighting Nazis.
Yep. Well done. As I mentioned, Marvel Mystery Comics #6, Namor is given the electric chair for his crimes against the surface dwellers, but the electricity just energizes him. Doesn't kill him. I love this. Marvel Mystery Comics #7, Namor, in a fit of rage, rips off the top of the Empire State Building and sends it hurtling down to the street. So, not necessarily concerned about the passerbys, but here's the actual art in Blake Bell's book. Now what? This is Namor. The Empire State Building. So they're proud of this, are they? Then maybe this, he's twisting off the famous spire, will impress them. Throws it down in the street below, crashes into, looks like some vehicles, and woman running away with a baby. Tremendous. Mystery Comics #8 and 9 is his first battles against the Human Torch. Again, they're sometimes they're allies, sometimes they're adversaries, depending on what Namor's doing. We already mentioned the importance of Human Torch #5, the epic 60-page battle. Go ahead, Mert.
Oh, yeah. The first time that the Torch and Namor actually fought as full allies was Marvel Mystery Comics #17, which is reprinted in its entirety.
Fought as allies, you said.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, against the Axis powers, of course. And if you're curious to read that, it was reprinted in its entirety as the contents of Invaders #24. It was a fill-in issue, basically. It gave Roy Thomas and his collaborators a month off, but they just reprinted that whole story as...
And also, to piggyback on that, if you don't mind reading your comics digitally, if you go to Marvel Unlimited, I use Marvel Unlimited for some of the research for this. A lot of these Golden Age stories are on Marvel Unlimited, so you can see them there as well. What else before I jump into the Silver Age?
Let's see here. There were a couple of other Golden Age things I wanted to throw in. Most of his run in Marvel Mystery Comics I don't have any notes on, but the first appearance of Namora, his cousin, as we said, was #82 from 1947. Her full name was Aquaria Nautica Neptunia. Apparently, Namora was more of an honorific.
Yes,
the avenging daughter of Atlantis. Namor described her role as Namor's partner and lieutenant, or whatever her official capacity was, than it was her actual name. Let's see. We mentioned that Bira made his one and only Golden Age appearance then in #82. And then he was a backup feature in the Human Torch's ongoing title. We mentioned he was in the All Winners. The All Winners squad as a team. I mentioned they were in only 2 stories. Those were in issues #19 and 21 of All Winners Comics. There was no issue 20. I don't know why. But yeah, this was in fall of 1946 and winter of 1947, so the Nazis were safely not a factor. So they just fought a couple of villains named Izbiza and the Future Man, respectively.
Great.
And Otto Binder wrote
Oh, wow.
crossing over from Fawcett for that occasion. And he also appeared in All Select Comics. And on a creator level, you should mention that Bill Everett troubled soul that he was. He served in the U.S. military.
Yes, he did.
For a number for a few.
He served both in Europe and in the Philippines.
Yep. So there's a couple of tours of duty right there.
Yeah.
He was away from comics for about 5 whole years, and during that time, most of the work on the Namor strip went to a couple of artists named Alan Simon and Carl Pfeiffer. So they were kind of the go-to substitutes for Carl Everett for a lot of the Submariner stories published during that time of his absence.
Well done, sir. I'm jumping to the Silver Age, if that's okay with you.
Alrighty.
So we mentioned FF4, of course, is the return of Namor. We already talked about that at length. FF6 is his first team-up with Dr. Doom.
Yep, first of many.
Yes.
The Diabolical Duo, as
Yes.
the cover called them.
Now, again, it's... Sometimes their interests align, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they'll work together, sometimes they'll be at odds. Supervillain team-up, that classic Bronze Age series, they would have several Namor Doom team-ups in that.
You betcha.
So, for example, in these early stories, Namor's people are rendered helpless by a nerve gas from the surface. Doom promises to help them in return for Namor helping him in his fixation on defeating the FF. That's when Namor is one of the few times he's in his red trunks, by the way, which he only wore briefly. I had to mention FF9, Namor as movie producer.
Yeah, that's one of the sillier ones.
Yes. The FF gone bankrupt.
Yes, because Reed made some bad Wall Street decisions.
Yep. And Namor has taken over a movie studio with his vast undersea wealth. And he hires them to be in a movie. They don't realize it's Namor, though, correctly, right?
Not at first.
Yeah. Doesn't he have, like, the long cigarette holder, right?
I haven't read the story,
Yeah,
so I can't picture
I think
it.
so.
It's referenced in Saga of the Submariner,
Yes,
but then again,
and,
everything's referenced in Saga of
Yes.
the Submariner.
And obviously, it's an elaborate ruse to try to trap the F. And, of course, Namor is fully intoxicated with Sue by this point, so that's always a part of his agenda as well. We have to mention the early stories. There's even because Sue will often be jealous of Reed in these early Silver Age stories, and she'll even taunt him with her attraction to Namor, for example. I had to mention Daredevil number 7.
Before you do,
Please, sir,
let's
please.
mention FF Annual number 1.
Please.
That is when Namor rediscovers his Atlantean
I should have mentioned
heritage.
that. Well done, Murr. Go ahead.
Yes, it's the first appearance of Warlord Krang, and it's Namor's reunion with the Lady Dorma, who is his cousin and paramour, who was betrothed to Krang as the... I guess later on it was retconned in that Krang was just kind of regent, not only in place of Namor, but of Prince Bira, who had kind of ascended the throne in Namor's place. But Krang, was, as you've mentioned earlier, had a strong romantic interest in Dorma.
Yes.
So he had 2 reasons to despise Namor when he finally returned, for ousting him from the throne and from the arms of Dorma, who was never really that into him to begin with. So there you are. So Namor finally gets his people back. And then in the same story, I think he loses them again because he shows his devotion to Sue. It was greater than his devotion to his rediscovered Atlantean people. And so they all kind of abandon the undersea city they had been calling home at that time by the time he gets back to them after finding medical care for Sue. So he finds his people and loses them again, all in the span of one extra-sized
Once
issue.
again, the theme of a man in both worlds doesn't belong to either one fully. Well done, Murd. I had to mention Daredevil number 7. Now, if you're a Silver Age fan, your heartbeat should be quickening right now. Well, Wally Woodard on Daredevil. He was only on Daredevil for a couple issues. Go back to our Daredevil in the Silver Age spotlight back for, I think it was 2014. So Namor wants to hire Nelson and Murdoch to represent him to try to regain Atlantis. And he ends up in a battle with Daredevil. And it's the classic story where Daredevil has no match for the Submariner, but he keeps fighting him to the point where he's like hanging on to Namor's leg while Namor is walking away and dragging him. And Namor's moved by how brave and gallant and how Daredevil's trying to persevere.
He has no fear.
No fear. The artwork is, I mean, you've all seen the cover of Namor and kind of punching as Daredevil flies backwards in the water. It's a classic Silver Age issue. Highest recommendation. Go ahead, Murd.
Yeah, before we get into the Submariner solo stuff, the first time Namor and the Fantastic Four fought side by side was in number 33, and that is the first appearance of Atuma. All right, now.
So, Namor's first eponymous series from the 60s, heavy hitter artists in this. You had John Buscema, Murd mentioned Marie Severin, Dan Adkins, who's right from this area, for example. Sal Buscema, Issue 8 is, to me, issue 8 is one of the classics of the Silver Age. It's a famous black cover, In the Rage of Battle. And it's the Thing and Namor going at it. What's important is, again, Roy Thomas, the master of continuity. An older woman appears to try to calm Namor down at the end.
As she so often did back in the Golden Age.
And then he reveals, in fact, I'll read right, because it's classic Roy Thomas scripting. Read right from the story here.
Which he quotes himself, Roy Thomas does, in Saga of the Submariner years later.
Yes. So, perhaps no one on the police force could have stopped their battle from laying waste the city. No one but a widow named Mrs. Prentice, whom the eternally young Submariner once knew as Betty Dean. And her face collapses in her hands as she weeps. Great Roy Thomas stuff right there. The Buscema art on that is breathtaking, by the way.
And Mrs. Prentice would continue to be a presence in Namor's life for some years to come after that, too.
And then she dies, though, eventually.
She
right?
does, yeah. We'll get to that in the 70s. But before we go any further with the Namor solo series, though, could I throw in a few highlights of the Tales to Astonish run,
Please.
which lasted 32 issues, beginning in number 70, replacing the ousted Giant Man as the Hulk's co-star there. It began with a 6-issue arc, which was somewhat unusual for the time. It was the Quest for Neptune's Trident, in which Namor went on a quest to find Neptune's trident, which is, I guess, proving re-demonstrating to his people whose faith in him had been recently shaken, his worthiness to rule. He had to go and find this symbol of royal power, which is Neptune's trident, and so he spends 7 issues questing for this thing. He battles the Seaweed Man along the way, who is a big man made out of seaweed. It's just a fun Silver Age monster there. All of this drawn by Gene Colan, incidentally. Some of his earliest work for Marvel, certainly his earliest regular work.
He might have been under the pseudonym Adam Austin for some of those issues.
He was. Good call there, Chris.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, because I think he'd done 1 or 2 anthology stories before that, but I think this would have been his first regular gig on any kind of Marvel series. He battles a giant Atlantean doomsday device called the Behemoth along the way, which is, like most good doomsday devices, resembles a gigantic gill monster.
Of course.
Let's see. There's kind of the Secret Empire makes their first appearance in the Marvel Universe in Tales to Astonish number 83. They actually reared their ugly heads in both the Submariner and Hulk strips during that time. And Bill Everett makes his first return to Submariner. But before he tries doing it regularly. But in number 87, he puts his hand back in. Prince Bira makes his Silver Age resurgence in number 90 after being kind of Namor's childhood friend / antagonist from the 50s stories. Roy Thomas does his first Submariner scripting in number 93 and remains the regular writer for some time after that.
Yes. He writes some of the early issues of the eponymous series as well.
We mentioned the first appearance of Walter Newell's Stingray in number 95 of Tales to Astonish. Hulk and Namor, the 2 strips intersect for a full-length brouhaha in issue number 100 by Stan Lee and Marie Severin. And the final issue of Tales to Astonish, number 101, written by Archie Goodwin, with art by Gene Colan and Dan Adkins. That's what introduces this Paul Destin character we've been talking about. He called himself the Man Called Destiny. And so that's where we finally learn, or at least we see the first part of the recounting of what happened to Namor before he went amnesiac and was lost until the beginning of the Silver Age. So we see the destruction of the Atlantean city that he had called home at that time, and the seeming death of his mother and grandfather.
Yep.
So that's the first time we see Destiny. Excuse me. And then there was that Iron Man and Submariner one-shot, which leads directly into the Submariner monthly series by Thomas with that great John Buscema artwork you were talking about. He gets his first team-up with the first installment in his long-standing rivalry / alliance with Triton of the Inhumans.
Yes.
At that time was Marvel's other big underwater character. That was in the second issue of that. And issue number 5, we mentioned, was the intro of Tiger Shark, his sister Diane, and Dr. Dorcas, who would be kind of a regular foe or annoyance for Namor for some time after that. The Lemurians, number 7 is when that's when Destiny re-enters the picture. because we get the second part of what happened between him and Destiny sometime earlier. But now Namor catches up with Destiny, who is making a run for president of the United States.
Is he wearing a version of the Serpent Crown or some kind of...
well, yeah, that's what I was talking about when I said the Serpent Crown was coated in
kind of like a V almost?
Yes,
okay,
yes,
I remember
it's
now.
gold
so
in
was
color.
Encased in that. All right,
Right.
That's
So,
what I
and
thought.
that was
Okay.
done by ancient Atlanteans to
Right.
try and
Mute its power. Yeah.
right, attenuate its influence over the
Right.
wearer. But it didn't completely work because, in addition to awakening, as you've said before, Chris,
Yeah.
his latent psionic power, it also drove Destin mad.
Yes.
Made him somewhat megalomaniacal. And just imagine a megalomaniac with an ugly inanimate object on his head running for president. Could it really happen in the real world? So who knows? Maybe Trump's toupee is a serpent crown under there somewhere. But yeah, he and Namor get into a battle on a rooftop, and at some point he's so carried away with megalomania and personal grandeur that he throws the crown away, saying, "Ha! I don't need this trinket any longer. I can levitate without it." and plunges to his death.
And as far as I know, he's been sidewalk paced ever since.
He's one of the few Marvel characters that no one has ever bothered to bring back.
Oh, that's tremendous.
So there you go. That happened in issue number 7 of the solo series. Number you have number 8 on the list here. You just talked about that. That brings Betty Dean back to the picture. A clash with the Thing, and then number 9 is his first clash with the Lemurians and their then king, the ancient Naga, and that is when the Serpent Crown, as such, first appears in Marvel Comics.
Gotcha.
We're also
Well done,
introduced
sir.
to a character called Carthon the Quester, who is a benevolent ruler of the Lemurians briefly until Lyra takes over a little later on.
Issue 14 is the death of Toro from the Golden Age. So they kill off that character, at least at that time. As you mentioned, 19 is the first appearance of Stingray in his costume. I've always been amused at issue 20 for the first appearance of Orca, the human killer whale.
Human killer
Want to talk about him at all?
Oh, of course. Third string Marvel villain. You asked me if I want to talk about him?
Murd, I should commit seppuku. That was ridiculous. Go ahead.
All right, so Orca was just an Atlantean foot soldier who was chosen to be the subject of a mutagenic process that would make him kind of an ultimate soldier. He was a true giant. I mentioned earlier that Atuma was kind of a Goliath figure. Orca was... I'm not sure whether this is his height after the procedure was done to him, but it almost had to be. But
So the Atlanteans themselves did this procedure to him?
yes,
Okay.
yes. This is an inside job.
Okay.
He was 24 feet tall and weighed 20 tons. This is probably as a result of he could draw strength from killer whales.
Okay.
At first he wore a special power sapping belt that enabled him to
Imbibe their power.
their bio auras,
Yeah.
if you will. So he was always stronger when he was in the presence of a pod of killer whales. Later on, he internalized that power. I think he went to the Brand Corporation and they gave him the ability to do
the
that
Brand Corporation.
without the belt. Yeah, always getting their big mutating nose
Yep.
in other people's business. So yeah, he was a pretty serious threat for Namor, as a few undersea dwellers were. He's probably the one that's closest to being in his weight class of all undersea beings. And among his power set was kind of a blowhole patched into his back that enabled him to survive on land
Yeah.
as well as water.
And I think he's still around, if I remember correct.
Oh, he's a great visual.
Yeah, he has a great visual.
Blue skin and the cowl with
Yeah.
the ring of teeth around his face. Yeah, the
There's
writers and artists love
There's a
playing with
goofy
him.
grandeur to that, I must say.
I don't know if Ed McGuinness has ever drawn Orca, but he needs to.
Well, okay, you got to read the new Avengers stuff, Murd.
Because Ed McGuinness is drawing that.
Yes.
And is Orca in it?
I think he is. I'd have to go back and read the issues, but I think he is.
Yeah.
Tiger
Fantastic.
Shark is.
Fantastic.
All right, as you mentioned before, issues 34 to 35 is sort of the Defenders prototype story. This is written by Thomas, where the Submariner is temporarily aligns itself with the Hulk and the Silver Surfer. So we have to remember the Silver Surfer is considered one of the founding members of the Defenders. Doctor Strange will take his place in a sense, but he was there at the beginning. 37 mentions the death of Dorma. We already talked about that story.
Brought about by Lyra of Lemuria,
Yep.
who first appeared in number 32, and as
Indeed.
we've said, is kind of a tragic, divided figure in her own right,
Yes.
parallel to Namor's own self-division.
issue 50, as I mentioned, is Everett returns to the character he created. And one of the first Submariner comics I ever owned as a kid was a Bill Everett story from this time period. I didn't realize his significance, of course, at the time I was very young, but issue 50 also introduces Namorita as a character. And I also mentioned issue 67. This one, John Romita Sr., who was one of the great costume designers for Marvel in the 60s and 70s, introduced Namor's black costume. What do you think of that costume?
Well, it was very 70s.
Yeah.
No question about it. I describe it as a disco wetsuit, or perhaps a leisure wetsuit would be a better way to describe it.
Oh, Jesus.
There was an in-story reason why he needed to wear this silly
Let's hear
thing,
it.
too.
I don't remember that.
Apparently, in number 66, he was battling Orca again, and he was exposed to some kind of nerve gas, which rendered the entire population of whatever Atlantean colony he was nearest unconscious. But it had a tragic effect on him in that it destroyed, or temporarily destroyed, everything's temporary in comics, his cell's ability to retain moisture on land. So he had kind of lost his father's genetic heritage of being able to survive on land, unless he wore this special water recycling suit that kept his cells hydrated. And it also somehow looked like he was going clubbing at Studio 54.
Low cut, with the navel and
those crazy underarm fins. Yeah. As I said, it's very 70s.
But they've brought back variations of that costume over the years. Like, he often appears now in a black type of costume. In the current Avengers stories, he's in a. It's not that costume, but it's a sort of a version of it.
It's what they tend to put him in every time he needs to act villainous for a time. Like when he was part of the Order in the 2000s, when the original Defenders became corrupted by Yandroth's curse and became kind of overlords of the world, that was what he chose to wear.
And because I don't recall seeing Namor in his green trunks for quite some time now that I think about it. But Murd, that was clutch. Any other quick little checklist items before we move on?
I think I do have a couple other nuggets of clutchness in here somewhere. Well, let's see. For a time there, Everett was not able to stay on as Submariner scribe for that long a time.
He's very ill.
His health was declining yet badly, and he died in 1973.
Correct.
So Mike Friedrich helped him out a little bit as a co-scripter, and so did Steve Gerber. And Gerber ended up taking over as writer towards the end. A story that was pure Gerber occurred around issue number 64 of the Submariner, in which the Submariner had received an SOS from a group of characters called the Four, who came on a golden submarine from the land of Zephyrland. In the town where I was born. So, he basically teamed up with distant analogs of the Beatles to go back to Pepperland to defeat a warrior woman named Virago.
God, I love Gerber.
That's just classic Gerber's Bronze Age insanity there. Around the same time, a little earlier actually, something else that Gerber had a hand in issue number 58, we were introduced to yet another love interest of Namor's. This is the red-skinned warrior woman named Tamara Ran.
I dimly recall her. Okay.
You can probably picture her.
Yeah.
Yeah, she had red skin. She was from an alien planet named Lob, which was mostly water. So it was kind of like Namor's version of Mera, you might say. Alien water warrior queen type thing. The two of them had a tryst for a while, but eventually she became the lover of Tiger Shark.
Yikes.
Then
thrown over for Tiger Shark. Wow, what does that do to a guy's ego? Man.
No, accounting for taste.
Yeah.
Issue number 61 from 1973 introduced us to a villain called Dr. Hydro. And the Hydro base, which we mentioned earlier, which became the headquarters for the Avengers for a time, was originally Dr. Hydro's
I didn't know that. Okay.
It was there where he kidnapped a bunch of innocent people, including poor Betty Dean Prentice.
And that's where she's killed, correct?
Not just yet.
Okay.
Not at first, not for a couple of years. But it's there where she's taken and, with all these other innocent people, mutated into green, scaly, amphibious people that Dr. Hydro called his Hydro Men. Tragically took away their ability to survive on land for very long. So they had to kind of come down and live in whatever Atlantis colony or outpost Namor was calling home at that time. So poor Mrs. Prentice, who had been kind of a foster mother to Namorita, it was her role as a supporting character to that point. She got to go down and see how the other half lives for a while before her tragic death, which we will be closing in on fairly shortly. Oh, and talking about your marathon history of Atlantis earlier, some of the details that you cited during that historical recap actually came out in a brief series of backup strips called Tales of Atlantis, which began in Submariner number 62. And that's some early work by Howard Chaykin.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That's where we're first introduced to King Kamu and Queen Zartra.
There you go. Anything else there from the legendary legal pad, my friend?
A villain called the Piranha.
I remember him.
Yeah, first appeared in issues number 70 and 71, and then, hopefully coincidentally, the series ended with issue number 72 in September of 1974.
All right. I wanted to... well done, Murd. Whenever I see the yellow legal pad, it's those moments where you feel like, you know what, everything's going to be okay. Because the yellow legal pad is present. Thank you, brother.
Whatever you might forget to say might be in these little cuneiform-style ink scratches here in front of me.
It is remarkable, your cuneiform. A couple more quick things before we end the episode. I just want to mention other media. Now, this is interesting. I didn't know about this.
Oh, wait, is that all the further you're planning to go? Just up to... The last thing you have here is the costume.
Yes, unless you wanted to touch upon.
Well, yeah, I really only went as far as the end of the 70s with my own note-taking.
Go for it.
And the second half of the 70s, as we mentioned to one another before we began recording, Namor spent most of his time then as kind of an ensemble player.
Yes.
He's defined by his time as either in the Defenders or the Invaders or what have you. But yeah, I have down here the first appearance of the Defenders at the supervillain team-up, though.
Please,
I can't let this end without mentioning that.
Go for it.
Yeah, Giant Size Supervillain Team-Up number 1 and Giant Size Invaders number 1. Actually, both were published within a couple months of each other.
I love the Giant Size books.
March and June 75, respectively. And they helped to launch Namor in two very different new directions simultaneously. And this happening about the same time he was drifting away from the Defenders, which, as we mentioned earlier, he did not stay a member of very long. But yeah, the Supervillain Team-Up continued his relationship with Dr. Doom as his ally there, and it ran for 18 issues, and 11...
And they have him in the black costume in those, right?
Yes, definitely, which kind of helped to cement its association with his occasional role as villain, or anti-villain, if you prefer. And so for 11 of those 18 issues of Supervillain Team-Up, plus the two giant-size issues, Namor, those were Namor and Dr. Doom team-ups. And the second issue of the second monthly regular-sized issue of Supervillain Team-Up is the time when Betty Dean Prentice met her fate.
Doesn't she sacrifice herself for him?
Yes, because Namor is being held at bay by I think it's Tiger Shark and Dr. Dorcas again.
Such an unfortunate name.
Yeah, and so she jumps in the way of Dr. Dorcas's ray gun to save Namor from being shot. And she never regained her humanity. She died as a green, scaly person. But then Namor whirls on his foes, and I'm pretty sure that Dr. Dorcas doesn't survive that issue either.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Murray, because we've noted this obviously many times this episode. Namor will take life. Like, he's not. Again, he's a monarch. He's a warrior. He's not, a do-gooder who's like, I can't take life. He's taken plenty of life in his history as a character, and especially if a woman that he essentially loved was slain before his eyes, of course he's going to kill the person. So that doesn't surprise me one bit. What do you think of those stories? I haven't read all those supervillain team-ups. Do you enjoy them? Or?
Honestly, I haven't read all the way through them either, but it suffers from one of the curses of the Bronze Age of comics, in that it just couldn't retain a creative team and therefore a coherent creative vision or linearity of plot in order to really get itself off the ground as a fan favorite. So it went through a bunch of different creative teams.
I think Byrne was involved in it at the very end, actually.
I think you're right, now that you mention it. Jim Shooter was involved in it towards the middle. But yeah, I have a weakness for villains as protagonists, and so I have all the issues of that series in my collection, and sooner or later I will.
They will be read, sir.
I will give them the attention they deserve. And let me throw out a mention of another thing I haven't read yet, but the Submariner mini-series, like the 4-issue mini from 1984.
Yes, I've never read that either.
Yeah, that's it was written by J.M. DeMatteis.
Okay, now I really have to read it.
Artwork by Bob Budiansky. But it involves Namor getting into yet another one of his tragic, ill-starred love affairs with a woman named Jacqueline... I know I wrote it down. Jacqueline Truffaut, that's her name. where he meets her when he's consulting with representatives of the United Nations, trying to get Atlantis back in good with them for the 40th time. And this woman is one of the panel of experts talking to him. He's smitten with her. And then it turns out that she hates him because her father was accidentally killed during one of Namor's diplomatic visits to the UN back in the 50s when somebody tried to assassinate him and the bullet ricocheted off his body and killed her father.
DeMatteis acknowledging that when he was trying to be part of the UN in the 50s. Nicely done.
So, Jacqueline Truffaut has gone to the length of finding a second Trident of Neptune, since apparently there is more than one of them. She gets it, and she becomes this powerful mermaid, basically, and she and Namor have an underwater battle. She's totally unhinged by her hatred of Namor, but to his credit, Namor manages to depower her, throw her back on land in her humanoid form without just slaying her outright.
I'll have to read that because no one does tragic love stories better than J.M. DeMatteis.
Yes, and it's a strange tragic love story, which makes it even more DeMatteis-like. Yeah, it's kind of a funny little solo story there for Namor during an era when he really wasn't having very many of them. And he joined the Avengers about a year after that, at the end of 1985.
He was with them for some time. Yeah.
Yep, that's during the Roger Stern run. And
That's great stuff.
He and Hercules were at each other's throats from the start.
Which was always fun.
Yeah, it's one of the great hallmarks of that run, really, was the classic feud between Namor and Hercules. And then that's really all I've got in my bag of tricks here, Chris.
That was quite a bag of tricks, my friend. Never let me down. Magnificent. Thank you.
It's my pleasure, Chris. Thank you for providing the exhaustive framework for this episode.
You bet. Last two things I want to talk about. So a little bit about other media. This I found fascinating. So apparently in the mid-50s, there was talk of a live-action Submariner television show. Now, we have to recall that 1953, the Superman show with George Reeves was very popular. And you also had the show Sea Hunt with Lloyd Bridges, the father of Jeff Bridges. It was like an underwater adventurer show.
I remember it. Well, not first broadcast, of course, but I've seen reruns.
Yeah, so apparently there was talk, Martin Goodman was involved in negotiations for that, where they would bring the actor Richard Egan in to play Namor, and they were going to do a live-action Submariner show. It never got off the ground. It didn't happen. But I'm trying to imagine what that would have been like with 1950s television special effects. Interesting. I mean, it didn't happen. And then you remember the show The Man from Atlantis?
I've heard of the show The Man from Atlantis. Never seen it. Don't know anything about it.
There was also apparently talk supposedly of a Namor show in the 70s too. Also didn't happen, perhaps in part because they already had the show The Man from Atlantis. Now, where Namor did get on the small screen was, of course, the Grant Ray Lawrence cartoon, which we opened our episode with, 1966. Again, I love these cartoons, but part of the fun is, just like with Tony Stark in these shows, the voice of Namor is John Vernon, who is Dean Wormer from Animal House. So whenever I hear his voice, I just hear him talking about, being outraged that, Delta delivered, medical school cadavers to the alumni dinner. But so definitely check out that cartoon. It's a wonderful time capsule. Of course, that groovy, goofy theme song we just played, that wonderful baritone at the end. And when Marvel had other cartoons, like Shane would speak to this, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, he appeared in a couple episodes of that. And the various Fantastic Four cartoons from the 90s to 2000s, he would appear in those as well. So there's been an animated Namor on more than one occasion. Now, we've yet to see Namor in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I did a little bit of reading. I'm not sure how current the information I read is. Apparently, he was owned. Universal had the rights to the character at one point. And it seems, from what I've read, again, I'm not sure this is fully accurate, that's been more or less disentangled. Marvel may have the rights back at this point, or there might be still some contractual vestiges to deal with there. But I'm guessing at some point we're going to see Namor on the big screen. Now that Marvel has the Fantastic Four back and all of that, that wouldn't surprise me.
Only a matter of time.
Yeah, and I hope they capture that the dichotomy of the character we've been talking about. That they really capture that he's this is a complex being of two worlds, doesn't really belong in either one, or doesn't feel fully accepted by either one. If they go with that, it'll be a compelling rendition. I wanted to close by talking a little bit about Bill Everett himself, because, and again, you could do a whole podcast just on him. Again, this is the creator of the character, and he was born on May 18th, 1971. As Murd mentioned, he died young. He was only age 55. February 27th, 1973. I have back issues from the 70s where they actually announce Everett's death in the Bullpen Bulletin's page. And Everett, from his youth, was a voracious reader. He loved reading classics. He mentioned like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, for example, the Coleridge poem. He also was very influenced by commercial magazine art. So he clearly had abilities from when he was young. He was a veteran of World War II. He didn't speak much about his experience. I know he served both in the European Theater of Operations and the Pacific. I think he was Lieutenant of Engineers. Unfortunately, since his teenage years, he battled alcoholism.
Yeah. He had a bout with tuberculosis when he was about 12.
That's right.
And that kind of, the impact that had on his health kind of led into his his discovering alcohol.
Good. I forgot to mention that. Well done, Mert. And his wife also struggled with alcoholism. And like many people of that era, he was a very heavy smoker as well. And prior to going into comics, he worked on advertising art for various newspapers. He was an art editor for a publication by the tech company TECK called Radio News Magazine. So he had a lot of experience in commercial illustration. This wasn't just some guy who just, I'm going to draw comics all of a sudden. He already had a great deal of experience and skill. And
he'd had like a year and a half of art school before he dropped out.
Correct. And Mert, well done. And he heard about the burgeoning comic book field by a fellow artist. He worked with Centaur Publications on the Amazing Man strip, one of his first creations. And then, as we mentioned, moved from there to Funnies Incorporated, Lloyd Jackett's company. And eventually, Goodman, because again, Goodman wanted, when he saw how lucrative these properties were, he wanted to take control of them. So eventually, he bought them out from underneath Funnies Incorporated, and that shop went away, essentially. Remember, the packaging shops only really around for a brief period of time.
Right, they were filling a need, but then as soon as the other publishers that bought their services realized that how lucrative this was, they decided they wanted their own in-house talent.
And so that was the end of the shops. Everett eventually went to work for Marvel directly, and he worked in the bullpen. He would talk about his friendships with Joe Manili, the late, great Joe Manili, died tragically in a train accident in the 50s. John Severin, who only died just recently, if I remember correctly. They were all buddies. He worked on other like Venus, Marvel Boy, or other publications, the Atlas Horror Comics, did a lot of work on those. This is a very, not just a summary, this is if you look at drawings he did, like back in the envelope type sketches, he was a highly accomplished artist. Look at some of his drawings from the World War II era, for example. And he also, in the Menace #5, he drew Simon Garth the Zombie, a one-off character with Stan Lee, who they brought back in the Marvel horror era of the 1970s. He then left comics for a while, went back to commercial illustration. He returned to Marvel in the Silver Age.
Yeah, he'd been working as art director at a paper company,
yes,
which is, as he put it, a good job, and he didn't like it.
No, he hated it. And you get the sense as you read that he would try to keep his drinking under control, but it sometimes would affect his work, his deadlines, things of that nature. He returned to Marvel in the Silver Age. He roomed with Roy Thomas in two different apartments. The first one, 177A Bleecker Street.
I'm grinning ear to ear because I know the significance of that address. Indeed. The Sanctum Sanctorum of Dr. Strange.
And I'm going to read a quote from Thomas about Everett's time with him in the apartment shortly. And as Bird mentioned, he did some inking and penciling on Hulk, Doctor Strange. Of course, he's the co-creator of Daredevil.
It strikes me as kind of odd whenever I watch the Netflix Daredevil series to see it's in the opening credits. It says based on the comics by Stan Lee and Bill Everett, when in fact Bill Everett really only ever drew part of one issue.
Well, because he was having deadline issues, so they
couldn't even finish the first issue.
No, they believe that Kirby did the cover, and sources indicate that Kirby created the Billy Club, and which you can totally see Kirby coming up with something like that. And that they had to bring in like Ditko and Saul Brodsky to do like some backgrounds and inking and different things. But Everett was like, he was involved in drawing the book.
Oh, he was involved, sure. It just seems like there should be one or two other names in those credits there.
And then they bring him, and he was such a versatile artist, though. When penciling was a struggle, they would have him ink. He did coloring work, like he colored Silver Surfer #1. He's considered a great colorist. He was one of Kirby's favorite inkers. In fact, I read an anecdote when Kirby got his artwork back from Marvel after that terrible ordeal when he got all the artwork back in the 80s, or what they had left that they would give him, and he pulled out a page This is Mark Evanier tells a story. He pulls out a page that Everett Anthony, and he looked at the page and he said, Bill was a great guy. Like there was that nostalgia, that remembering that his friend. And then, of course, as you mentioned, he did some drawing and inking of Submariner and Tales to Astonish. And then he went to the eponymous title. And he wrote and penciled some of those stories he created in Amarita, but his health was failing.
Yep. And from one account I read, the fans weren't really enjoying his attempts at writing.
Which is a shame.
I mean, he was told to try to keep it close to what Stan Lee had been doing.
But again, he's the creator of the character, so naturally he's going to go his way with it. And Lee had given Namor a very different voice than the voice of the Submariner from the Golden Age.
Right.
And one thing I learned about his life that's very interesting is that in the last few years of his life, his wife passed away. He became an Alcoholics Anonymous sponsor in New York City, and he was totally dedicated to that. And he spent a lot of time going to meetings, helping other people, acting as a sponsor. And when he died, and when like a lot of the comic luminaries came to the funeral, there were all these people from AA that they didn't know who these people were, who were all touched by his efforts as part of that organization.
Thank goodness he was not forgotten in death.
And I'm going to read a quote here from Roy Thomas to kind of end the episode. And this is from the aforementioned Alter Ego number 46. Though he was the most human of men, he nonetheless inspired a kind of awe mixed with a genuine liking and respect. Over the next few years, he'd be given staff positions. He's talking about the last years at Marvel. Freelance status, whatever he seemed to need to give him a chance to realize his potential. Stan, as well as then publisher Martin Goodman, was always willing to take a flyer with him. So were the rest of us. Though he left ink-stained handprints on the wall of my first uptown apartment, it's the mark on my life and heart that I feel the most. So, to kind of end here, clearly this was a man who, he had weaknesses like all of us, but transcended those. And when you can nary find a bad word about this man from anybody in all the sources I've read, to me that speaks volumes about what the kind of person Bill Everett was and the impact that he had on the medium through his greatest creation, Namor the Submariner. So it's a testament to his ability that Namor continues to be a robust, thriving character in comics to this day. So, any other parting comments from you, brother?
The history of Namor the Submariner is pretty much, synonymous with the history of Marvel Comics itself. And I'm glad that we're able to pay homage to that character at such length and depth, in all of his complexity, all of his troubled mood swings. Yeah, he's always been a fun character to read, and I hope that we'll get much more of him in years to come, and,
here.
Both in comics and beyond.
Well, my friend, I think we've shot our bolt.
I would agree, Chris.
Murd's barely hung on. You've hung on, my friend, with this your illness. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's not so bad. But, yeah, I guess the time has come for us to, come ashore.
Take us out, brother. Take us out.
All right, and give another note of thanks here to the sponsor for this episode, which is the Collection Drawer Company and their flagship product, the incredible Drawer Box storage system, the easy access storage solution. A new way to store your comics so that you can access them at will. Go to collectiondrawer.com to find out more details. Also, find them on Facebook or Instagram. If you'd like to send us an email, the address is comicgeekspeak@gmail.com. If you'd like to leave a voicemail, you can call 267-702-6642. You can like us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @comicgeekspeak. We'd like to give you can also visit us at thecomicforums.vanillacommunity.com, which is the latest in a series of URL addresses for our listener forums, where you can talk back to us about this or a variety of other episodes of our show. Tell us your own experience of Namor over the years, or engage in a number of other discussions on other topics of a variety of natures with your fellow CGS listeners and friends. We'd like to give a special thanks to everyone who has financially supported the show recently or in the distant past. We really appreciate it, and the show would not be what it is today without your support. And as always, we are uniting the world's mightiest heroes, one listener at a time.
You got it on Wednesday, So laser beams, opinions like the seasons on everything you read in comics, movies, games, toys, artists, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek Speak.